Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today for our Responsible Revitalization Fall Planning Workshop brought to you by the Houston-Galveston Area Council. It's a beautiful day inside today. That's a little phrase that I share with my nephew who has autism, and he's having a hard time during these shutdown moments, and so we touch base. And both agree that's a beautiful day inside, and where that's inside the room or inside oneself, that it's going to be a beautiful day. So thank you all for being here and taking time out to learn and share. I want to thank you especially for being part of this important conversation and for the positive impact that each of you has on people's lives, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about community development, revitalization, terms that can be a bit abstract sometimes. The Fall Planning Workshop is an ongoing series. We host it each year at the Houston-Galveston Area Council. We take on topics that are very timely and important to the work that we do to help the region become a better place. It would not be possible without the hard work and continued dedication of our staff. I'd like to take a moment, if I could, and thank them. I want to thank Jeff Table, our Director of Community and Environmental Planning, and his team, Cheryl Murgo, Kathy Jansen, Andrea Tantalo, and others on that team. And we also have some top-notch Master of Ceremonies talent, Rick Guerrero, who will be working with you today to facilitate and lead us through the workshop. So thank you all on the HGAC team for the work that you do as well. I'm really excited about today's topic because it brings together different disciplines. It's so often that we tend to fall into a specific specialty or a specific discipline, and none of those single special areas of focus is the real solution to revitalizing or responsibly redeveloping areas, making our communities stronger. Making a difference is always more than one thing. Lives are complex, communities are complex. Pressures can accelerate during times like we're in now. Redevelopment can come very quickly, and that puts a lot of pressure not just on the structures that we often deal with, but the people in those communities as well. And so I am really excited that in this workshop, we're going to start looking at things from a whole person, whole community perspective. And I encourage you, whenever you can, to think of your work and what you hear today from a personal point of view, a personal perspective. What we're talking about is really kind of a story problem approach. It's not as simple as a basic metric, which oftentimes the funding that comes to do the work that all of us are involved in has certain performance requirements, delivering a specific number of meals to seniors, for example. But those numbers in themselves shouldn't be our real goal. It should be making the community stronger and making the lives better. So it's time to really start thinking about our work as a story problem, and we lay out the challenges. There's always more than one challenge, and we really resist that temptation to fall back into jargon and metrics, because life and the work that we do is very complex if we're going to make a real difference in people's lives. So as you work through the workshop today, I hope that you get some exposure to some great thinking and some great ideas. And at the end, that you'll be able at some point in the future to tell me a story about a person or a community, about the threats that come their way, the opportunities, and how you helped that person or community achieve a brighter future. It's important that we start by saying what we want to accomplish in terms of people. As I said, it's often a temptation to fall into our standard metrics, which are not really people-based, but to think about the difference that we have. Now, this is not easy to do. We oftentimes go down a different path with our work out of old habits, out of requirements that come from the projects that are laid out. But we should always be thinking about the difference we're making to the people and the communities, so we can have a richer community where there can be new opportunities, new investment, but still a preservation of the existing members and fabric of that community that made it such a great place to catch the eye of need for redevelopment or improvements in those communities. You'll need to be flexible as you go forward. There are things that are going to be unexpected that come up. There are going to be unintended consequences and results from some of the decisions and approaches that are taken in this. That's just going to be part of the process because it is complex. You need to be able to adapt, step back, and understand some of those unintended consequences. But I can't emphasize enough that this approach that's being talked about of thinking about things from people's perspectives is very powerful. I'll give you one quick example before I wrap up. I had the opportunity to lead a peer exchange with 9 other councils of governments from across the country from major metropolitan areas. We had Chicago, we had Washington, D.C., we had Boston, for example, Atlanta, Georgia, and we all got together to share ideas. And rather than fall into what are you doing in transportation, what are you doing in housing, what are you doing in jobs, it was more of an approach to what you're taking today, where all those things will be talked about, but they were done from the perspective of looking at personas, from looking at a profile of a person in a community and the challenges that they face. And there was no simple one solution. And that took some out of the box thinking. And it was a little uncomfortable for some folks, but we ended up really finding ways to make life better for people and reflect on how we can really make a difference in communities. So I want to thank you again for your time and being part of this workshop. I want to give you those little ideas to think about a different way of viewing our work that can have such a huge impact. There's an amazing lineup of speakers and panelists today. I hope you enjoy the workshop, and I'll turn it over to Rick Guerrero, who will take it from here. Thank you all again. Have a fantastic day. Rick, kicking it to you.
Chuck, excellent introduction. And we want to welcome you all to the Fall Planning Workshop today, December 4th. We are excited to have so many people on today. I'm going to be your workshop facilitator for the entire day, so get used to seeing my face throughout the event. My name is Rick Guerrero. Again, I'm the Director of Intergovernmental Relations with the Houston-Galveston Area Council. In that capacity, I lead a team of talented professionals that provide service to our member local governments in the form of educational workshops, trainings, and other resources. We ensure transparency and compliance with our Open Meetings Act, our Public Information Act for the entire agency. As you all know, we're not just a regional planning commission, we're a metropolitan planning organization. We're the region's workforce system, the area agency on aging. So we do have a lot of transparency work that needs to be accomplished to make sure that our message gets through to the people who need the services the most. We focus our intergovernmental collaboration on our federal and state agencies, our federal and state legislators, and our county and city partners also. I've been with HGAC for over a decade. It's a testament to what a great place it is to work every day in collaboration with many of the people that you're going to be hearing from today, all of our partners in the community and the experts, to tackle some of the region's most difficult issues. And we do it together, and that's what makes it all the more interesting. So if you are not speaking or presenting today, if you could, please keep your microphone muted and your camera turned off. That would be great. I imagine you all may have some packages that may be delivered ahead of the Christmas season. So if you could, please make sure that, keep those muted so that we don't hear your dog barking at the delivery person when they come. If you have any questions for any of our speakers or our panelists today, please just type them into the chat. When we open up for questions, our virtual moderator, Andrea Tantalou, who's already doing a fantastic job, will ensure your question is presented to the panel moderator. So today's opening speaker, I'm very excited about, Dr. Junia Howell with the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Howell is an urban sociologist whose work examines racial and socioeconomic inequality, particularly after natural disasters. You may have seen some of her work on NPR, the New York Times, KUHF, and PBS. Currently, she's working on some projects evaluating how socioeconomic inequality is influenced by neighborhoods, segregation, natural disasters, and the housing appraisal industry. So I'm very excited to hear what she has to say today. We're really pleased to have her kick us off. I would ask that if you could, for this time only, unmute yourself so that we can welcome her with a quick round of applause, and then go ahead and mute yourself back on. If we could do that right now, let's welcome Dr. Howell, please.
Thank you all. It's very kind of you. And thank you for the very generous introduction, Rick. Sorry, I'm getting all these like notices, start this, end this, so I'm trying to read and make sure, but hopefully you guys can see me and see my slides. If not, give me a quick shout out and I will adjust. So what wasn't said in the introduction, but is relevant to this crowd, is I actually got my PhD at Rice. And so I lived in Houston for 6 years in the greater Third Ward area. OST, South Union specifically. So I normally can't say those things and anyone know what I'm talking about, but I know that many of you in the call will, and that's really exciting. So I love Houston. I know this is not what most people say, but what I miss most is the weather. I love humanity and the heat. I know I'm weird, but it's genuinely a thing for me. So I, especially this time of year as the snow starts coming in up north, I am very sad to not be with you all in Texas. But it is a great honor to be with you virtually. As was just mentioned, my work kind of ranges over a broad number of topics, from natural disasters, of which I started in Houston for obvious reasons, and I'm happy to talk more on the questions and answers. But today I'm actually going to try to give a much bigger overarching argument and view on neighborhoods and community development and how that might be impacting your own work. So go with me. I'm going to go pretty quickly. I'm going to cover several things and really root our conversation today in history, hopefully a conversation that will be helpful when you break out later in other panels and other discussions to kind of get into the nitty gritty, which I won't be doing quite as much. So follow me back to the turn of the last century, when scholars like George Simmel were really starting to wrestle with the pros and cons of city life. Of course, this is coming out of the late 1800s, where industrialization was a huge topic within the academic space, and people were wondering, are cities going to destroy community forever? Are we not going to be able to interact with each other? Of course, others were seeing the great possibilities of cities, and so it became this toggle of how can we maximize what's great about cities while minimizing what might be problematic. Of course, this led into planning and the ways that people thought about these things, maybe most famously, or maybe just most famously in the circles or where I am, in the Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Chicago region, were all areas that I've either lived currently or lived previously. Ideas from another George Kistler, who really thought about city planning as we had to do, master plans, big plans, but these plans needed to integrate both nature and the city. So this idea of let's hold both in tension. Of course, this culminated in many ways with the Chicago School's idea of concentric zone theory. So hopefully many of you, at least planners on the call, are generally, or at least similarly familiar with this. But what I want you to remember, or at least learn today if you're not familiar, is how they kind of held these two things in tension, the goods and the ills of cities, as they thought the solution was neighborhoods. If we create neighborhoods, then people could really have that sense of community that they might be missing from a small town. They could have their local post office and their local elementary school while still being in proximity to all the other good things. Yet they also conceptualized what was important about these neighborhoods is making them homogeneous. So everyone that was the same socioeconomically, racially, ethnically, etc., living in one community, and this would enable them to separate what they saw as the ills and the people who were problematic in the city from all the people who are raising children and being the upright citizens. Obviously, I'm being a little sarcastic in my tone, very intentionally, because we can unpack all sorts of problematic assumptions there. In fact, scholars like Du Bois and the Atlantic School were unpacking these problematic assumptions back in the 1920s and 1930s, yet because of very explicit racism, both within academia and the planning world, those critiques aren't being listened to. Instead, the Chicago School became, I still can't say it, that's the word I'm trying to say, became the dominant way of thinking about neighborhoods. This then was followed in many ways. So as this rose in popularity, was followed by the stock market crash. And as of course, as no one needs to be told on the call, that led to a major depression, which started really culminating in problematic elements with housing. So what I mean by that is, as people quickly ran out of savings because they were losing their jobs or were either not being paid as much, they didn't have enough savings to pay for housing, leading to a wave of evictions. I've taught this history in classes and in various presentations, and this year I can't help but mention this and say, does this not sound familiar? There are so many things that happened between 1920s and the early 1930s about how we dealt with evictions, how we dealt with housing, how we presumed that this would create a health crisis if all these people were evicted, that are so similar to the conversations we're having right now in the pandemic. And in fact, in many ways, they're so similar because of how we responded in the 1920s. In particular, this obviously economic depression led to the rise of FDR and what became known as the New Deal plans, or the New Deal, not New Deal plans, the New Deal. And of course, what was central, or maybe you don't know, one of the central pieces of his whole administration was arguing that housing and reconstructing housing would be a key way of not only revitalizing the economy, but also really helping communities and individuals, particularly around this question of housing. So this culminated in the 1934 National Housing Act. And of course, this act has lots of different components, lots of things with renting and evictions, et cetera. But what I want to focus on today is how it reshaped the housing market. So in particular, before this point, the majority of Americans did not own homes, in large part because it was really expensive to buy homes, because if you were going to buy a home, many bought it straight out with cash. And those who did use mortgages on average were only 3 to 5 years. And down payments generally had to be about 50%. So obviously that is not affordable for most individuals, especially if you think about it now. If you're going to buy the house that you own now, or you live in now, or an apartment, whatever price that is, if you had to pay that off in 3 to 5 years, for the vast majority on this call, that would be utterly impossible. And so that was true in the 1930s. And so FDR's administration had this idea that if we change mortgages from 3 to 5 years to 30 years, dramatically decrease down payments, then we would open up the opportunity for individuals to own homes. And they thought this had lots of potential benefits. First of all, people could accumulate wealth within the thing they were living in. So this is where the notion of buying a home really is a good investment and increases your wealth. This comes from the 1934 National Housing Act and the many ways the propaganda around it, as well as having advantageous benefits for another economic recession or depression, where people would have a safety net, at least have a house to live in, even if they lost their job. So that was the idea. But of course, to incentivize the banks to go from 3 to 5 year mortgages to 30-year mortgages, the federal government had to do something. So their solution was to insure those mortgages. We'll take on the risk so that you'll do these mortgages. But they didn't want to just take on the risk completely blindly. So they really institutionalized the appraisal industry. There was appraisals before this point, but they weren't very common, they weren't systematic, and they weren't something that most people who were buying homes got. In order to institutionalize the appraisal industry, they famously created what we now colloquially call redlining maps. So this is the redlining map of Houston. I'm going to make a figure here so you can see it. I imagine, imagine most of you are familiar with these maps as they've become more and more known in popular culture, but if you're not, look them up. You can find them for any city. This is the Houston one. There's 4 rankings, A, B, C, D, and they were evaluating neighborhoods, which again, call back to that 1925 moment at the Chicago school. They really submitted the idea of neighborhoods, and neighborhoods as being homogeneous. That's what these maps were about. This idea that was in planning, that was in academia, they submitted it in federal policy by saying, we are going to rank neighborhoods and not only provide mortgages, which is what we often talk about when we talk about redlining, but we're going to actually evaluate homes based on what community they live in. That's how much they're going to be worth, or relative to each other. That's how much they're going to be worth. And this will drive how much homes can get for a mortgage, meaning that the federal government is kind of evading extreme risk by ensuring that homes that shouldn't be worth more are not. Now, what is important to note here is they had an opportunity in institutionalizing the appraisal industry to do this many ways. In fact, there was lots of discussions at the time to just evaluate homes based on the home themselves, but they deliberately chose to go along with the conversation going in academia and planning about neighborhoods and say, we want neighborhoods to be central, such that we're going to base the price of this home based on how much other homes in the community are worth. This created the comparable sale approach and really institutionalized a racialized approach to appraisals. This continued in a very formal sense until a series of 4 acts, starting with the 1968 Fair Housing Act and culminating in the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act. 4 acts together formally outlawed the use of the maps themselves in appraising and lending. However, the processes in which that put in place were not outlawed by these laws, something I'm going to return to. But I think it's important to note, as many of you probably know, the Community Reinvestment Act really focused on this idea of community investment. And that mainly took effect at saying we need to focus on communities that have been ignored previously. But little of the act or the organizations or the ways in which we've responded to this legislation actually address the roots of what I would say were the issues going on. So today, what I'm going to focus on is first discuss how academia in particular, because that's my realm and in sociology, has conceptualized community investment, how that has had then implications on planning and real life communities. And then I'm going to turn to the roots that we've ignored and why ignoring those is so problematic for really creating equity and fully revitalizing all communities. So starting with this community investment. So in my world, again, I'm a sociologist, I'm an urban studies person. So we often think about this as neighborhood studies or sometimes called neighborhood effects. Most famously, this kind of wing of the research, if you will, started with William Julius Wilson's The Truly Disadvantaged, which I'm hoping and I imagine, I can't see your faces, so I can't see your nods, but hopefully at least some of you are familiar with this work. If you're not, this is a sociologist who was studying the James Taylor homes in Chicago and really was the first to argue that neighborhoods or communities have impacts on people's lives beyond just their individual or their family characteristics. Specifically, where you grow up might have impacts on your long-term poverty, your education, your health, the crime that you are exposed to, your mobility, those residential and socioeconomic. So generally speaking, your well-being. Specifically, Wilson argued that these relationships were driven by various mechanisms, some including the lack of resources like adequate fresh food or grocery stores, an argument that has become very popularized in recent years, as well as resources in education. He also surmised that these mechanisms included the ways in which people interacted with each other, their social networks, as well as environmental factors, dumping. So all these pictures are from back when I lived in Houston. So they're all Houston examples. Obviously, dumping is a large issue and has been a large issue in several Houston neighborhoods, as well as how other external actors like police or teachers interact with residents in particular communities. So using all these mechanisms, he argued that there was a general relationship, negative relationship between these things. Okay, so I'm being a little mathy here for a second. So on my x-axis here, you see I have childhood neighborhoods. So starting over here with advantage down to disadvantage. And then on the y-axis, I just have a general relationship with socioeconomic status. So we see a general negative relationship. But actually what Wilson argued was that there was a curvilinear relationship. In other words, if you want to think 8th grade math, just x squared, it's not that complicated, although it sounds complicated when you say curvilinear. But basically, theoretically, what he was arguing is that in really advantaged neighborhoods, that they were mainly driven, the outcomes were mainly driven by individuals and their families. Neighborhoods weren't really mattering. So this line is representing the effect of neighborhoods. And you can see up there, it's pretty flat. It's null is the other statistical word for it. But neighborhoods start to really matter for those living in disadvantaged neighborhoods over here in this box. And so he, however, with his 1987 piece, didn't have a lot of empirical data for this, but lots of studies, in fact, thousands of studies following him have tried to empirically show this relationships. Many of these studies are quantitative, including work by Doug Massey, who I imagine many of you know, Robert I can't talk, Sampson, Pat Sharkey, etc. And generally speaking, these studies have found this negative relationship. They then go on to hypothesize a curvilinear relationship, but very few, if any, have actually mathematically tested that curvilinear relationship. And even though they're quantitatively looking at a full spread of neighborhoods, they often focus on these disadvantaged neighborhoods. This is further justified by another strand of work of urban ethnography. So these are kind of what I think of as the fun things to read in urban studies. I love them. They're often engaging. But one of the really problematic elements of these urban ethnographies is they often use the neighborhood they're studying and compare it to an unspecified, unstudied kind of normal neighborhood. So in one of my pieces, I look systematically at these works and show how we haven't studied these normal neighborhoods. And actually a lot of the assumptions we're making about them are not true. In fact, this not only perpetuates ideas that we can focus on disadvantaged neighborhoods, but increases this notion that there's this curvilinear relationship that hasn't actually been tested. So in others of my papers, I actually throw in mathematically this, okay, so this is the hypothesis, let's put in an X squared term, let's see if it actually has this slant. And yet, when you put that into the model, it does have a curvilinear relationship, it does have a slant, but it's in the opposite direction, meaning that neighborhoods in more advantaged places are having a much stronger impact as the neighborhood itself than the other factors of community of family, of individual factors. In fact, if we stratify this by race, we see that for white residents who primarily live in the most advantaged spaces, this relationship is particularly strong, while for Black residents, kind of no matter where they're living, neighborhoods are not really mattering, particularly in a statistically significant sense, since I'm using a sample here. In short, what I'm saying and what I'm arguing is that while we have focused on this disadvantage component, what's really driving a lot of what we're seeing is the advantage side. Unfortunately, that has meant on the planning side that we have poured a lot of resources and investment, which in many ways is needed. I'm not trying to suggest it's not, but we've tried to solve the problem by pouring in investment and or moving individuals, relocating individuals out of communities that we conceptualize as disadvantaged or marginalized without ever dealing with the roots of what's driving this. So now I want to turn to those roots and examine exactly what I mean by them and what contemporarily is still perpetuating some of these inequalities. So let's go back to that redlining map that I mentioned earlier. And again, this is the Houston map. So hopefully it looks familiar to you, and you can see how communities were colored in various ways. Again, federal documentation shows repeatedly that these were racialized patterns where communities that were white and affluent were ranked as A or green, and those who were increasingly less socioeconomically advantaged or more communities of color were ranked down the line of blue, yellow, and then finally red. So as I mentioned, the practice of actually using those maps was outlawed in 1977, but I also alluded to that how they use those maps historically was they started with the sale of the house that they were looking at. And they said, okay, how are we going to decide if this house is going to get a loan and how much it's going to be worth? Well, the process included, generally speaking, although there are exceptions, comparable sales. And what comparable sales means is similar homes within that same community. So when they were using the maps, they used those maps as saying you had to find a house within the same color community. Color as in the physical color drawn on the map by the federal government. And then that would be the baseline for evaluating how much this house is worth. Now, when the maps were outlawed in 1977, they no longer could pull from the maps, but they used the system still of starting with the house that they're trying to evaluate and choosing similar homes. Now, there wasn't the use of those homes by the color coding maps, but how they chose those homes were not legislated, and there's a lot of flexibility within the appraisal industry for how they can choose those homes. Now, if you want to go into details, I have plenty of details and plenty of examples, but just generally speaking, we find that appraisers continue to pull homes from the same racial communities. So to explain this further, I'm going to jump into two of my publications on this. And the first is actually focused on Houston, which is really fun. And so what we did here is we actually used tax appraisal data for all the single homes in Harris County. So as you guys know, I don't have to tell you, Harris County is huge. So that means almost 1 million different cases, and this is appraisal data. So it means we have all sorts of information about the individual parcels or properties. And so this first graph that I have up here already shows you the difference when we're just looking at neighborhood racial composition and the value of homes. So to help you understand what's going on here, there's a $420,000 difference between the general sale or home value, of homes in white neighborhoods in Houston compared to Black and Latinx neighborhoods. This is huge. I mean, enormous. But that said, it doesn't take in consideration things like the house characteristics, so how big it is, if it's brick or siding, if there's a fireplace, if there's a pool, how many bathrooms, all those kind of things, as well as housing quality, how well was it constructed, how recently was it renovated, all these other elements. And because we know the historical components of racial redlining, as well as other racial discriminations that perpetuates racial socioeconomic inequality more generally, we would expect that if we held all these things constant, that this inequality decreases. And in fact, it does. So this second model holds all those housing things constant. So now we're comparing houses in Houston that are identical in all things that we can really think matter to an appraiser. And we see that there's less inequality, but it's still quite stark. So then we want to introduce neighborhood conditions. So everything from school quality to crime to how many feet it would take to walk out your front door and get to the closest park, poverty in the neighborhood, socioeconomic, other socioeconomic variables like employment and vacancies and all those kind of things. So when we take a whole bunch of neighborhood characteristics into consideration, we once again see this inequality does decrease, but not nearly as much as we would expect. Finally, we take into real estate demand. So often when I present this to real estate agents and appraisers and other people who are familiar with the housing market, they go, but it's really just demand. It's that people want to live in white neighborhoods. And so we use various markers that have been seen as the most rigorous markers of housing demand as far as how quickly houses are sold, how many people are looking at them, how much housing values have to be decreased before they go through sale price, all those kind of things. And again, we see only a very slight decrease in inequality, suggesting that a ton, over $200,000 of the inequality in Houston between housing values is just because of neighborhood racial composition. So in order to really understand this further, we paired it with a qualitative analysis where we went in and actually observed appraisers, interviewed them, followed them around, etc. And repeatedly, we saw that although they're not using the formal redlining maps, they're still pulling comps from racially similar communities, even when other communities that are similar in socioeconomic status are available. One example of this that really highlights it is an appraiser who was talking about a house that he was appraising in a deeds restricted Latinx neighborhood north of Houston, or north of downtown. So again, I probably can't be as cagey as I normally am in national talk, since you guys can probably figure out where these things are. But he called this neighborhood the ghetto and suggested that if he was pulling from a comp, he would need to pull from another Latinx community that was much further away and of lower socioeconomic status. In fact, he deliberately compared it to the neighborhood right across the highway, which is a middle-class white neighborhood with really similar housing. Again, you guys probably, I have a map here, so you can figure out what I'm talking about, which is great. And yet he said that this neighborhood is vastly different than the one that is right across the highway. And if he had to pull a comp from this neighborhood and couldn't get it within the neighborhood, he would pull from University Park, a higher income, obviously, as you guys know, white upper income neighborhood. And so these examples, as well as many, many others, show us how appraisers are still using these racialized lenses to evaluate homes. So our question was, is this all cities or is it just a Houston thing? And how has it changed over time? So in our most recent publication on this, what we do is we look at how housing appraisals have changed since 1980. Now remember, the redlining was formally outlawed in 1977, so we're hypothesizing by 1988 is a good baseline for kind of post the era of formally using these maps. And so as you can see here, what I'm first showing you is just descriptive data, no modeling, just exactly how it is across the country, all the metros kind of as an average together. And as we would expect in 1980, homes in white neighborhoods were about twice as much as homes in communities of color. Yet what you might not expect, or at least what I didn't expect, is over time, this inequality has in fact doubled. Meaning that not only has it persisted in the racialized notions, but it's actually increased in the ways that we evaluate homes through a racialized lens. In fact, when we hold everything that I was mentioning, not quite the same because we're using national data, but we hold many of those same things constant. So housing quality, as well as neighborhood quality, et cetera, we see that this inequality has actually increased even further. So when you're comparing the same houses in really similar neighborhoods, the racial inequality and its increase over time is even more stark. Another way of understanding this or thinking about it is an identical home in a very identical neighborhood, but was in a majority white neighborhood, would have appreciated on average $225,000 from 1980 to 2015, while its counterpart in a community of color would have only appreciated $31,000. So this obviously has huge implications on racial wealth gaps, as well as neighborhood development and even federal aid. So as mentioned previously, that some of my work is on natural disasters, which is where this federal aid comes in. And I'm not going to go in extreme detail about it, but I will just mention that in these publications where we look at FEMA aid and effects after a disaster, we find that these racialized appraisals are being used in the way that the federal government is deciding how much communities should, and particularly individuals, should get to repair their damaged property after disasters. In fact, when we simulate these broader models and look at wealth inequality more generally, what we see is this is the amount of wealth being gained because of disaster. And so the biggest part of the graph are individuals who, sorry, it's on this side, individuals who experience the strongest disaster and the most FEMA aid. And what we see is white individuals are actually gaining money from natural disasters over time, while Black and Latinx individuals are losing money, creating a growing racial inequality gap just because of how our federal aid is continuing to use these racialized appraisals to determine how much aid a property should receive. So in short, when I think about responsible revitalization, I can't say that. I really would argue and encourage you all today in the workshop to think about why disinvestment has happened and the roots of that both historically and contemporarily. And specifically, the various policy implications and specific plans depends on what we're looking at, right? And I have various ideas on those things, but generally speaking, as a principle, I think when we think about historical elements, we need to ask what policies, what plans have actually created the disinvestment and the inequality that we're seeing? And is there atonement needed for that? Is there ways in which we need to not just address what's going on now, but think about the historical piece? And then what I find we do the least in the urban planning and the urban studies world is actually ask what current policies are actually perpetuating this inequality, not just sustaining the historical element, but increasing it. And what can we do to actually change those policies that are not just focused on putting a Band-Aid solution and saying this community needs X, Y, and Z, but what is the broader systems that are perpetuating and increasing this inequality, and what can we do about them? So with that, I will close my comments and open it up for your questions or engagement.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation, Dr. Howell. We appreciate it. I think we're going to now go to a question and answer session. Do we have any questions that were input into the chat box at this time, Andrea?
No, not yet, but if anybody has any questions, they can just type it in the chat and we'll get those questions out for you.
Yes, if you have any questions for Dr. Howell, now is the time. Your chat box is going to be located at the bottom of your screen, and click on that, and we will get your question asked to Dr. Howell. Last call for questions for Dr. Powell. Okay. Anything, Andrea?
Oh, okay. So we do have a question. Is how long has she been working on this? And there's a second question too. So.
Yeah, so on this goes broad, but on the appraisal piece, me and my co-author, who was actually at Rice with me at the time, who worked on now multiple pieces, I showed you two of them, but multiple pieces on appraisals. We started on the appraisal work, I want to say in late 2013, early 14. My work on neighborhoods, the work I was showing you that's kind of counteracting and thinking about how neighborhood effects influence residents. I started that work most kind of fully in 2012. So in short, 6 to 8 years, depending on which project we're talking about.
Thank you. We have, what housing policy changes do you think would be most impactful?
Yeah, so I do think, and I'm increasingly thinking as I'm working on this in various elements, that one thing that we have to change when it comes to housing is how we appraise homes. And I think that when we really want to sit down and consider that, it becomes a very tense conversation because it's going to require rethinking many of the people who have these conversations own wealth and your own ways of engaging with your housing. But what's really surprising to me, and this was kind of shown in what I showed today, but is more evident in some of my more recent work that I wasn't showing, is that when it comes to housing values and housing appraisals, while it is striking that homes in Black and Latinx and in various other communities, in various other cities, and Indigenous communities as well, it's striking that their home values are not increasing. The trajectory or appreciation of their home values is actually much more similar to the appreciation rates that we saw between the 1930s and the 1970s. What's different, what's shocking about what's going on is the enormous explosion of home values in white communities. And so if we're going to really deal with the affordable housing crisis, if we're going to deal with how this is impacting wealth, we have to rethink how we have built a community that invests so much in wealth being appreciated quickly in housing, and not only disentangle race from appraising and how houses are evaluated, but also think about this as not something that can sustainably increase every 3 to 5 years, is which we've been seeing the last 2 decades. But appreciation rates need to be a lot lower, which also means that people cannot make money off of buying and selling houses as quickly, which has lots of various implications. So that was still kind of abstract, but hopefully it gives you some ideas of how I'm thinking about it. Specifically, I'm working with the Appraisal Foundation, the appraisal industry. I actually have the opportunity of meeting or presenting and working with them next week. We've been having a long-term relationship, but really diving into some new legislation on the federal level, hopefully, that will be picked up in this next Congress, to think about how we re-regulate and change the ways that we appraise homes, and how that then affects apartments and renting and all these different elements of housing policy.
We have another question. It's curious about your thoughts on atonement. Is this recreating prior federal housing policy with more intentional racial outcomes, or much broader in your opinion? And also maybe think about, is this something that's going to happen on a local level or a state or more federal level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a lot of pieces of this. I love all these questions, and they're great for broader discussion. So I would say that my personal work is more on the federal level. That is where a lot of my attention has been, as I just mentioned. I'm working on the federal level with these things. And that goes for both changing the appraisal industry, that goes for FEMA. I've been working with FEMA now for a couple of years, and hopefully launching a bigger project with FEMA. So changing those federal current policies, as well as the quote unquote atonement piece, or thinking about, I'm playing with different words here, right? So sometimes reparations is used, sometimes atonement, and I've been using atonement to really think about how we have to deal with the inequalities we as a federal government have created and approach them. So my focus is on the federal. However, I think there is more room than I think initially imagined for these to happen on the local and the state levels as well. And I think part of that is because things can happen more quickly, obviously, sometimes on those levels, but also because it is not that this has only been federal policy. Again, that's where my research has been focused, so that's where I've been focused on interventions, but how cities have responded and contributed to these things are also on a city level. And so cities need, and regions need to think about how we contributed to this problem, and thus what can we not only do to change whatever we are currently doing, but address the inequalities that we've created.
Thank you. We have one final question in the chat, and this is, what got you interested in the elements of inequity in disaster recovery?
Yeah, so that kind of has two parts, if I'm honest. So one part was living in Houston and watching the habitual floodings that were happening at this time. So this is between like 2010, 2016. So this is before Harvey is when I lived in Houston for natural disaster range. But lots of habitual flooding, right? And seeing how natural disasters weren't just the big ones that we pay a lot of attention to, which are horrific and we absolutely need to address, but were also things that were happening yearly and pervasively and having lots of impacts on communities in really unequal ways. So seeing who was getting aid and what ways they were getting aid when the bayous kept overflowing. So that was my personal entry into it, as well as more of a practical entry of to just be transparent, being asked to use my quantitative skills to help a broader project. And so in doing that, I started really just getting interested in what wasn't known about this and what we could know given the data that we did have.
Excellent. Dr. Howell, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate having you. I apologize for not recognizing that you are a Rice grad when I was talking about your bio.
Oh, not at all. You're fine.
Know if you were more of a Steelers fan already or if you were still a Texans fan at heart or not. So I decided to leave that out. But thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
It's 9:15. We're going to start our first of two mini breaks. So the remainder of today's workshops are going to be broken into two mini break activities and three panel discussions. They're going to be focused on equitable housing, equitable jobs, and transportation. So for our first mini break, I'm going to walk you through a few polling questions that Andrew's going to put on the screen for us. They're going to better gauge a relationship you guys have with the topic of equity. The results are going to show up in the slides you see on the screen in real time. We're getting fancy here. So broadly speaking, equity is defined as fairness or justice in the way people are treated. So keep that definition in mind as we move forward to the following questions. So Andrea, if you could put the first mini break question on the screen. So how much or how often do you incorporate equity into your day-to-day job? How much of your day-to-day job is directly focused on ensuring people are treated fairly and equally? We'll give you guys a sec. Okay, interesting. All right, we've got about 40% of you who have voted. Let's see if we could break that 50% of you who have voted mark, folks. Let's get some more votes in. How do you vote? So you should have a pop-up on your screen. If you are on the phone, you're likely not going to be able to see this, but it should have popped up on your screen. There's a poll. It says mini break question 1 in progress currently.
The panelists are unable to vote as they are co-hosts, so that answers the question for you, Laura.
There you go. Excellent. Okay, so 40% sometimes. We got about 25% often or always, and 10% rarely. Okay, so excellent. So kind of a mixed bag here. So let's go to question number 2, if we could now, Andrea. The next question is, what do you consider the biggest barrier to incorporating equity into your work? So if you could, please provide a 1 to 2 word answer. We're going to do kind of a word cloud. So your responses are going to come in real time. So 1 to 2 word answer, if you could. Okay, so when I said word cloud, what I really meant was I'm just going to read the results as they come in as a poll. So, okay, I don't know enough. You need to learn more. Good, you've come to the right place. Fantastic. 56% of you said that. I don't want to, but don't have the data we need, or want to, but don't have the data we need. We don't have the money to try new things. Okay, 11% of you and others. Okay, excellent. Great information. This is going to be very helpful, particularly for a panelist moving forward. It's always great to know your audience. Okay, excellent. The next question is going to be, what do you see as the biggest short-term opportunity to incorporating equity into your work? So if you could, please answer the poll that is on your screen. Give you guys a minute. Interesting. So the majority of you expand public meetings or engagement to include new audiences. Good. 16% seek diverse candidates when filling new positions. Interesting. Only 15% of you said incorporate equity into an upcoming plan, update, or revision. So that's interesting. Excellent. Okay, great. Okay, and that is it for our polling question. So it looks like 48% of you said expand public meetings or engagement to include new audiences. That is honestly something that I think we at HGAC are also looking into more and more, particularly in this virtual environment. One of the silver linings in this pandemic has been that we've been able to reach audiences in particular rural areas or that may have otherwise not been able to come to a meeting, say in the Houston area. We represent a large 13 county region. So for many folks to be able to call in and listen in on some of the decision making that's happening or be able to actually watch what's going on, I think has been very beneficial. How do we continue that into kind of a post-pandemic world where we still allow people to contribute without necessarily having to make that drive and making their access a little more equitable, while at the same time recognizing that there is a digital divide? And how do we make sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate, whether they have a computer or internet access or not? So those are some tough questions that we have ahead of us. And I think this pandemic has really kind of laid the groundwork for a good trial on this moving forward. So we're going to get started with our first panel. We brought together some experts from both public and private entities discussing what equitable housing really looks like for the HGAC region, our 13 county region. So our panel moderator is going to be Mr. Luis Guajardo. He is an urban and regional planning professional with 10 years of public and private experience. He leads the urban policy team at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at the beautiful campus of Rice University, a group working to bridge the gap between theory and practice. So if you all could, at this moment, please unmute yourselves momentarily so that we can give Mr. Luis Guajardo a round of applause.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Rick, and good morning to everybody out there. Today, this Friday, we're delighted to be with you all. I'm a big fan of Dr. Howell's appraisal research, and I find that it was a really great way to frame today's conversation. It's really quite telling just to see how stark the differences and persistent racial inequities are, despite some of our best efforts. And it's humbling to see that there's still quite a lot of work to do. I'm really excited to have this conversation today with Keith, Laura, and Libby, who have been on the front lines of really interesting work in our region, both in our region and outside of our region. And I think they have a lot to share with this group today. Prior to getting started, though, I did want to share just some housing related announcements, specifically from the Kinder Institute side that we've been working on that I think could be a good resource for all of you. And a reminder that there will be links included as well at the end of this. So don't worry about having to jotting this down rapid fire. The first plug is that we are, this year we did do an inaugural 2020 State of Housing in Harris County and Houston report. And there are a number of indicators that are available online for download. You can go to datahouston.org. We will have an update in January of 2021 as well. And again, there will be a series of housing indicators that you can use to do comparative research, or if you practice and or live in Harris County, I think could be very useful. The second is that we are also working with a very talented consulting team at the Kinder Institute and with Harris County to do the Harris County Housing Study, also known as My Home is Here. It's underway, and it's informing a 10-year plan by the county for sustainable, affordable housing. There will be a final report in the summer of 2021. And so we invite everyone to take the survey at myhomeishere.org, spread the word with your colleagues and with your neighbors. This is really informative, and it's going to help drive future housing development in the region. And we're in the county, which is a big part of the region, but also I think it's the first ever housing plan by the county. I think it would be very important. So take a moment to do that if you can for us. So to help kind of frame the conversation today, we're talking obviously about housing equity in this first session. I wanted to go back a little bit and think about within the city planning community, at least, the equity has been a key undercurrent going back all the way to the 1970s as a reaction to the civil rights era. It was really championed by over in Cleveland, specifically by a person named Norman Krumholtz, which some of you may know. He brought social equity front and center in the influential Cleveland Policy Planning Report. This effort would re-envision local government as an ally of social movements and enshrine kind of a new approach to how local planning would take on for decades to come, and inspire a lot of work and iterating a lot of that over the next 50 years or so. But nearly 50 years since this legacy, I ask you all to reflect a little bit on what forces and movements are playing out in your own communities today that are causing us to reevaluate what equity means and how to bring it into mainstay of everyday practice, and how we elevate it from an undercurrent to a tidal wave for better cities and better lives. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get to our panel. So panelists, please introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about your background in the arena of social equity, housing equity specifically. How do you define housing equity, and how does your work connect to that definition? And we'll start in order. I'll start with Keith, and then we'll go Laura and Libby.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. I'm Keith Jacoby. I'm the executive director at Vision Galveston, and we are a community building nonprofit organization that connects a vision we share for our island to the resources that make that happen. I think it's important because we're talking about equitable engagement with the community, the origin story of Vision Galveston was really because the city was embarking on their comp plan and asked us to work with philanthropy and come up with a really robust engagement opportunity. And so over a year-long process between end of 2018 to 2019, we had a very robust engagement process. We worked with over 8,500 community members for those of you who know Galveston, that's about 15% of the population, which is typically more than vote in an election. So those numbers were really critical, and the diversity of those that engaged in this process was massive. All socioeconomic levels, race, ethnicity, age, gender, interests. So it was really a large scale process, and fortunately we had Oscar Robinson on our side doing that planning. So it was very robust. My personal background with this, I am a Galvestonian, lived here for 18 years, left and came back. I worked on some community development projects in Las Vegas, really on the education side, but had never worked at this scale on an urban planning project. So I kind of had a trial by fire way into this, but really excited to be here today. And, on the equitable housing piece and how we interact with that as an organization, Vision Galveston was an engagement vehicle, which has now turned into a backbone organization for this plan. And as you all, I'm sure, are familiar, the key issues that came up in our planning process were affordable housing, education, open and green space, and entrepreneurship or economic workforce values. And what we decided to tackle first, because we thought it would be the easiest, was that affordable housing piece. And the way that we have done that, our first initiative was to incorporate and establish a community development corporation, which we call Build Galveston. We have just created that. We've seeded the board. We've secured some funding and we've applied for C3 status. So we've got a startup within a startup, which is also really interesting. And that's where we are. I mean, we have major issues in terms of commuter rate. We have a 65% commuter rate in Galveston, which means around 20,000 people come onto our island every day that do not live here but work here. Problematic for many reasons. Our teachers, firefighters, our workforce across the board cannot afford to live here any longer. So we're really trying to address that through a myriad of ways in conjunction with the city. So we're excited to begin upon this work and really support, how do we support and rebuild those traditional sustainable neighborhoods in every sense of the word, with housing, green space, and all of the things, comprehensive community development wise. So thank you for having me today. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Keith. Laura?
Good morning. My name is Laura Clemens. I run a company called Collaborative Communities, and I founded my company in 2009, and it was based in pulling together partnerships around assisting communities that had seen disinvestment to be able to stabilize and begin an upswing, and looking at the complexities of partnerships that need to be brought together to solve the equation of why disinvestment happens and what can be happen to stabilize a community and start it towards an upward trajectory of economic development and equitable housing, green space, general access to many types of services. I come from the art background, and I'm a school teacher by training, and I was a community activist. And so Alabama was hit by a major disaster in 2011. We had 67 tornadoes in one day. And so I went from a community activist organizing around neighborhoods to being a volunteer in disaster recovery. And I got really interested in what it was that went into the federal policy piece of making decisions about what was allowable and what was not allowable in federal policy. And so I've spent, since 2011, I've become a federal policy expert because I was very frustrated with the way that Alabamians, especially in rural communities, the smaller the community, the less resources you have to be able to understand what the federal rules are and how you can take advantage of them. A small community has the same rules set forth as, or a private nonprofit has, as New York City has, with 5 floors of lawyers. And so I ended up working for New York State Homeland Security after Sandy, and did a lot of federal policy compliance. And then I moved to Texas to use my federal policy knowledge to help really small rural communities across Texas. So I focus on communities under 20,000. Most of the communities that I help are actually under 10,000 or smaller. And so the way that equity plays into what I do, because I have an arts background and I have a background as a teacher and a community organizer and activist, I really look at things, especially in housing and general design after a disaster, or development in general, is one of the most inequitable things that we can do is to say that beauty should be reserved for those that have money, those that have access, those that have privilege. That beauty is something that is extra, it's tangential, and that it doesn't need to be built in when we're looking at things that are just serving the minimum function. And I believe that that is foundationally inappropriate. And that is one of the biggest disservices that we can do to people, especially in the aftermath of a disaster, especially to communities that really they're starting out from a place of less access to begin with. And so the more that we can integrate beauty into the integrity of design of what we are doing after a disaster, and in general, what we're doing with what we're building every single day and what we're renovating and how we're treating communities, I think that that's the most important thing, that the role that equity can play is integrating beauty.
Fascinating story, and really, I'm really interested in kind of digging in a little bit deeper and some of your experiences there as well as Keith's. Libby, you want to kind of tell us a little bit about yourself too?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning. So my name is Libby Bland. I'm a senior planner and urban designer with Osakura Robinson. My background is in architecture, city planning, and oral history. I believe wholeheartedly in listening to people and the different ways that they experience and know their communities. I was recently chosen also to be a culture of health leader with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and I'm going to be studying and proposing programming around how to build a community of health through housing in the next 3 years. I think that housing is a basic human right, and that building a healthy community starts with good quality, affordable housing. It's impossible to move through the world in a healthful way, in a way that allows you to thrive if you don't have a good quality place to go home to. And I think that that also spreads to the neighborhood level. And I think it's impossible to separate the idea of equitable housing from equitable neighborhoods. When you're looking at those good quality, affordable housing aspects, you also have to think about the supportive services and resources that help people stay in their homes.
Thank you very much, Libby. So we have a really, interesting panel. I think it's so interesting to have both Keith and Laura coming from kind of non-traditional backgrounds, and then and kind of getting involved. And this is what the principle of self-governance is about. And then Libby, you have a really strong design background, so I want to dive into some of this. But I'm curious, and I'll start with Laura on this. How does the definition of housing equity shift when we're looking at the myriad of communities, whether it's urban, suburban, rural environments? You've had kind of a wide spectrum working, like you said, in Sandy recovery. You got really pulled in by what was occurring in your own backyard in Alabama, and then you've been here in Texas doing some significant amount of work. So I'm curious, what does this look like? What factors come into play when you're working in different communities?
So I think that it's less about urban to rural. I see a lot of the same things. We're all pretty much the same. We're all people that want the same things, no matter where we come from or what our backgrounds are, what kind of community we live in, what scale of community we live in. We all want the same sort of access to, good quality education, good quality housing, somewhere safe that we can feel safe, we can feel part of a community. But I would say that the biggest thing that I see is that larger cities that have greater access to resources just by their sheer size, they have larger budgets. Of course, they have larger expenditures, but I deal with communities that don't even have one single paid staff, not a single paid staff person. So oftentimes when the federal government comes in and says, here's the Code of Federal Regulations, here's compliance, just read these 300 pages and you'll be fine. And it's the unpaid volunteer city secretary, or it's a private nonprofit that's eligible for FEMA recovery. I see a huge amount of not understanding that there is a huge gap between going into Houston and going into a community of 2,000 people that maybe have 2 paid staff people. So I would say that that's the biggest gap, is just resources and understanding that when federal aid or grants, there's all this money available, there are all these resources. Who will organize those resources for a community where the city secretary is not only the one in charge of the recovery, but she's also got her own damage to her house to deal with, or her mother's home, or her cousin's houses. And so, it's just a lack of understanding that resources can be available, but you can't have the bandwidth or the staff power to access those resources. And so we need to figure out a way to modify the way that we think about delivering services and support to communities that don't have the ability to ask. They don't even know where to begin to start asking, or have a person that has the time to ask.
Yeah, no, it's impactful. It seems like it's just very like the difference from a small community, like you said, where you have a city secretary maybe having to interpret federal regulations, just seems onerous. I'm also curious, Libby, you've done some consulting work in also different settings as well, and I'm kind of curious how you have seen some of these factors come into play when, obviously limited to consulting, but if you, even in your personal life, if you've seen this manifest itself differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that there really isn't that much of a difference when you're looking at a really low income community in a big city to looking at, a lower income community in a rural setting. It's still a question of access. There's still all of these neighborhoods, particularly in Houston, where you can drive into a neighborhood and feel like you've gone into a completely different city, and you're looking at the resources that just aren't there. So when you're trying to figure out what equitable housing means from one neighborhood to the next neighborhood, it really feels like you're delving into a completely different arena. We've heard a really great discussion so far around inequitable disaster recovery, and Laura's certainly going to be talking about this a lot more. But when you're looking at, the neighborhoods that have recovered post-Harvey in the city of Houston, it's a completely different story if you are in, say, Acres Homes, or you're in, a lower income community where people aren't coming to your door to help you figure out these resources. If you don't know off the top of your head how to get access to those resources, you're not going to get them. Or, if there aren't translation services that are available to help you gain access to these resources, there is such a high barrier to entry to getting the things that you need to provide for your home and for your community.
We've, yeah, that point that you bring up about differences even within areas with a lot of resources, we certainly uncovered a little bit of that during our state of housing work, where we noticed we had to look twice, but we uncovered that in the areas that were hardest hit, the areas in the last 10 years that have lost the most Black home ownership were also areas that overlapped with that have flooded in the last 10 years repeatedly since in Houston in the last 10 years. And we had to look twice at the numbers, and Black homeowners were the only ones that actually net lost homeowners in Harris County. And they were all the top 10 neighborhoods. I think 8 or 9 of them were predominantly hit pretty hard in flooding.
Well, one of the things that I think somebody brought up earlier was the generational wealth loss. That this isn't a problem. I hear so often people say, well, why don't they just move? I don't understand why people live there. Well, if in this country, wealth is built on land ownership, and there was already a huge gap with communities of color coming into that land ownership to begin with. And the land that they owned in the beginning of the generational land ownership has stayed in families for multiple generations. That was not the best, highest land in town. It was not the driest land in town. It was not the safest areas of town. It was the least desirable land. And so now, 4 or 5 generations later, why do they still want to live in that neighborhood? One, it's a generational home. Their community is there, their family is there. But also, when you have built no value into your land ownership, but your value has decreased, your wealth has decreased over time to being practically nothing, what will you move with? What will you go somewhere else with? What will you buy another home with if the home that you still owe a mortgage on, or if you own outright because it has been handed down generationally, is worth nothing? Then what do you do? And I think that that's where Keith's work and Libby's work in health is so interesting to talk about some of these generational issues.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think we also have to consider, as these disasters happen, as daily life happens and your home falls into disrepair, if you can't get access to a loan from a banking institution in your community to be able to repair your home, then it's just going to keep deteriorating. And so that major disaster comes and you can't recover. You can't get FEMA funding for whatever reason. You can't go down the street and get a loan. Maybe there's not even a bank in your community. Maybe it's check cashing facilities that don't offer that service. You fall into a hole, and it's so impossible to dig yourself out of that hole. And then it just happens over and over and over again.
Yeah, it could be a vicious cycle. I am curious, Keith, as well, to hear a little bit about, in Galveston, you guys have been confronting the topic of kind of the intersection of resilience and housing, because you're literally at the front door of storms, and obviously feel the brunt of that in a much different way than some of the more upland communities. And I even think there's just a psychological notion, like if you live on the island, you may have to live with the fear of storms differently than we all do further upland. But I'm curious how, kind of what is the perception of affordable housing in Galveston? How has that evolved since you've been there? How have the disasters and people through Vision Galveston kind of talked about this topic of housing equity?
Sure. Yeah. And it's dicey, right? So that's the best. I wish I could say it a better way. You use the term affordable housing in Galveston, which I don't think we're a unicorn in this. And you get some, those of our community that really understand it and those that bristle. And it's the nuance of the terminology, right? So we've had to do a lot of work around saying, cost attainable housing, workforce housing, our teachers are really humanizing the housing. For those of you familiar at all with the housing issues that occurred post Ike in Galveston, a large majority of our public housing was wiped out after Ike. There were massive debates, arguments. It was very ugly within our community, trying to figure out, do we replace those units? Do we take the funding from the GLO? On and on. And there is so much, I guess I would call it PTSD from that era, even though it was, 15 years ago. So even when I returned, I wasn't here during that phase, but you can see the sweats that start as soon as you say affordable housing or equity. It doesn't matter the term you use. I will say though, without realizing it, everyone in Galveston realizes that we are on the, we're past the point of an affordable housing crisis. We are deep in it now. The train is out there. So no one is denying that. It is their perception of what affordable housing is. And so, I think we had McCormick, Baron Salazar come in, and they've really done beautiful work. And so during that shift, I think now we're in a little bit of a better place where, even what you alluded to, Laura, that the beauty of the housing, right? They have done beautiful work. It's well maintained. It's mixed income housing. And I think that's changed the perception, which is helpful for our work. But, that those conversations that are still rooted in, a lack of understanding about equity, deep-rooted racism, just a misunderstanding of what affordable housing is and why we need it. I hear this phrasing a lot. Well, why can't these workers just live in Texas City or Friendswood or wherever that is? And what I try to explain to people when I'm talking to them is, so if you work here and you teach our children, you shouldn't be able to live here. And when you phrase it that way, they, oh no, that's not what I mean. And I'm like, well, when you turn it around, and so I think it's just a matter of contextualizing and understanding that affordable housing is for everyone, and really making the economic argument that, business continuity through an accessible labor force is critical for us, especially because we are subject to disaster. If we have a disaster and half of our workforce can't get on the island, it's problematic for so many reasons. So I would say the narrative is still challenging, but I do believe as a community, we are starting to understand the necessity of addressing this in a more strategic way. I don't think the municipality has really, approached this with a really strategic plan so far, but they are working towards that, and they recognize that. So getting in a better place, and how that, affordable housing dictates the health of our city, the number of students that are going to be in our school district. I think there's a bigger understanding of what it means now. So hopefully we can continue that conversation, but language will be critical, and how we present our affordable housing strategy and what that ecosystem looks like will be critical to our success, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Laura, I'm also curious to hear from you on this, because you specifically your work in Wharton has been of late. I think you've done some really amazing work there, but I'm curious to see on the front line, when you talk to people in the community, how have you seen kind of the notion of housing confronted, and how have you seen an evolution in the way that it's talked about locally?
Well, I wanted to build on what Keith just said, which is when you have, for me, the languaging will never get better until we have examples of beautiful housing being built that serve our affordable housing needs. And this isn't something that is related to government money. HUD money, a HUD dollar is the same as a bank dollar. There is no difference between a private sector dollar and a government dollar when it comes to building housing. There is no restriction with HUD that the people that receive, I'm developing about $25 million worth of housing out of CDBG-DR money flowing through the General Land Office. And the reason that I worked so diligently to get as much money for as many developments in small communities in both Wharton and Port Lavaca. I put in probably 25 applications for small communities scattered across Texas for this CDBG-DR money for affordable rental housing, because I know what kind of people go into building with government money. I know what kind of large firms have a profession of building housing with that money. They can deal with the government paperwork. They're very big. They have a very well-oiled machine when it comes to getting the money and building units. They build units, they put roofs over people's heads, and they say, what we need rooftops. And that's what they get. They get rooftops. Maybe they are maintained, maybe they are not maintained. Who ends up owning those and how they were designed and where did they go within the context of the community? These are not things that the big giant development corporations that deal with federal money think about. They don't typically. They are national firms that are really well skilled at this. I am not a national firm. I am one woman, and I am working with little tiny owners of little tiny pieces of property of people that love their community. They love their neighborhood. They love their neighbors. They love the people that are being impacted by these disasters, and they want to help. They are not set up to do federal compliance. They do not understand federal money. And so I offered them the opportunity of, let me take on the burden of the federal compliance piece. Let me get the money for you. And all you have to do is be the one that takes care of and owns these properties and cares for your tenants as members of your community, and really members of they think of them as family. And so in developing all this housing, I want to shift the perception through building multiple infill. Each project that I have has multiple sites, because instead of building one big 100 unit development, I'm building a little bit of, I took the 100 units and I'm building, 5 units here at this infill spot, and I'm building 10 units over here at this infill spot. I'm trying to fill in around downtowns. I'm trying to design things so that the context and the fabric of the neighborhood is so that you can see that you can build housing that honors historic preservation, that looks just like it's always been in the neighborhood. And I get questions every day. I'm known in my community as being the Section 8 apartment lady. Like, that's what people call me. Oh, that's the Section 8 apartment lady. I'm not building apartments, and we're not doing Section 8. Not that there's anything wrong with Section 8 vouchers, but that's not what I'm doing. This is, people that have to pay rent kind of housing, but because it's government money, everyone goes to the lowest common denominator. They think of slums, they think of slumlords, they think of properties that are not well maintained, and they think of crime. And until we, the developers, start turning out better quality products, of course, we're going to have the notion that affordable housing is garbage, because, to be honest, we can all look around and look at what affordable has resulted in, and it's not good design, and it's not properties that have been properly upkept.
I have to agree wholeheartedly. I think the biggest shift in our narrative was the look and feel of this affordable housing that replaced the former block looking work. And so I think it's the biggest thing when we show people this is what we mean by affordable housing, and they go, oh, well, that's beautiful. We want, it's aesthetics, right? It's the shiny penny. And there's nothing I can say, or our group can say, or anyone else. You have to show them the demonstration of, it will look like this, it will be maintained like this, and the proof is in the pudding. So I agree. We've done scattered site, we've done larger units, but that's, Laura, I can't agree more. You have to show them what that's going to look like. So,
Laura, curious to from that work that you've been doing, how many projects have you been able to affect in terms of that, working with some of the larger developers that, and it kind of reminds me of the quote of, like, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago and the second best time is now. So a lot of the work that you're doing, hopefully will, in the long term, provide fruitful, but I'm kind of curious to hear how many you've been involved with.
So the Harvey recovery money that came out through the General Land Office came out in 2018. I'm very appreciative to what the General Land Office has taken on with Harvey recovery. I work with communities across the United States, and the state of Texas was very aggressive in getting a huge CDBG-DR allocation. In one sense, because the need in small rural communities is so large to have this housing replaced. They already didn't have enough housing in many rural communities. The GLO did a huge service to Texans in getting the largest disaster recovery allocation of HUD money ever in history. In the same sense, I look at states that don't have the kind of great advocacy that the state of Texas does, that the General Land Office does, and that the elected representatives do in Washington to get those big pieces of money. And it is disheartening that it's left to politics to have your leaders fight for that money at a federal level to be able to then siphon it into the communities. But how much have I impacted it? We're just now getting under contract. This money takes a long time just because it's federal money. There are a lot of hurdles to overcome. There's no such thing as fast government money. It doesn't exist. And so it's very slow to roll out. We're just under design in Port Lavaca. We haven't even, we're not even formally under contract yet in Wharton. These projects, in the next 2.5 years, that it's about, how long it will take to get to have ribbon cuttings is probably about 2 years from now. And so by that time, we will be 5 years after the disaster that we're just starting to get people in. Now, this housing was needed regardless of the disaster. It's especially needed after the disaster. But, I think there is no way to affect what other developers are doing until you're willing to stand up and do it yourself and do it better. Look, I'm a former school teacher. What do I know about being a developer? And one of my friends, a great friend and colleague, John Anderson, who runs the Incremental Development Alliance, and this is one of the resources I was going to mention at the end that people can go to. He says, what does it take to be a developer? What kind of training do you have to be a developer? And he said, you get a business card that you can get online and you put the word developer on it. And that's what it takes. And you figure out, how you're going to fund these resources. And incremental developers are people that are of the neighborhood. They love one block and they love one building and they want to do something with that one building. And they want to create affordability for their neighbors in that one building. And that's how you build, it's not having the big giant national company come in with their 100 units. Maybe for some bigger cities it is, but for most places, 1 unit, 5 units, 10 units, we need little, but we need a lot of people stepping forward to say, you know what, I don't know much about it, but I can figure it out. I can connect with other people that do. And with Libby's work with health, this is mental health. You need community. You need to have something positive happening in your life, and you need to have a sense of community coming around. And Libby, I would love for you to speak to the role that you see with mental health playing in overall health.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is some of the work that I do, and I can talk more about my professional work, but some of the work that I do outside of my 9 to 5 is explicitly around interviewing folks in housing. So over the last decade, I've been involved in a series of projects that have been genuinely oral history projects about housing, where we sit down and we talk for 30 minutes to an hour with one person about what has your experience been moving from house to house to house? How has that affected you? What do you carry with you emotionally when you are displaced that often? What does it do to you when, maybe you've lived in this public housing tower and that's getting demolished and you're being pushed into this other building, but that's also slated for demolition in the next 5 to 10 years as, the state of public housing, the state of subsidized housing changes. And it is fascinating and heartbreaking, but that's the building block of how you're able to see yourself in the world. It's very difficult to remain tethered is a difficult word to use. It's very difficult to remain placed in a society if you don't feel like you belong, if you don't feel like you have a place you can return to on a night to night basis, right? There's the whole issue of being unhoused that we're also probably not going to have a lot of time to delve into today, but is a huge component of affordable housing that we have to think about. What does it look like to develop a place where people can feel stable? And something else that I would want to talk about is a little bit more about the housing study that we've been working on for Harris County, where we have been really explicitly targeting people who are facing multiple needs in their neighborhoods. So folks who are maybe differently abled, folks who are seniors, folks who are, lower income, folks who are, maybe not as proficient in English. And so have all of these needs that are sandwiched on top of each other and how they're going about finding housing or keeping affordable housing. And we've been really explicitly, we built a data-driven approach to be able to target people in those neighborhoods to talk really explicitly about what their needs are and to bring them into this conversation. We know those are a lot of the communities that typically are overlooked in planning processes. And it's really important to make sure that they're given an equal voice in this process.
Yeah, and I would highly recommend you all connecting with Libby and the engagement and the rest of our engagement team on the Harris County Housing Study on how they've been able to not only to stack a lot of those needs, but also target media and target through trying to target people through their mobile phones in those areas. There's been some really extensive efforts to make sure we're intentional about including underrepresented voices in that process. I do want to make sure that we allow a couple of minutes for audience questions, and then if not, we can probably wrap up in the next 3 to 4 minutes or so. Rick, does that sound good to you?
Yes, that's great.
Great.
Perfect timing. And Andrea, do we have any questions in the chat for our fantastic panelists?
We don't yet, but now would be a great time for people to type those questions right there in the chat. We did have a note from one of our staff here at HGAC that said it was great to mention the Incremental Development Alliance. It's a tremendous resource. And then she shared a link to it. So if anybody's interested in that resource, the link to it's right there in the chat.
Also, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
Oh, I was just going to mention, we had talked about mentioning resources of how people cannot have to recreate the wheel on your own. Yeah. And for me, it is really about reaching out to my networks of people. And for as evil as Facebook can be, my world of Facebook is super positive because I'm a member of really wonderful communities online through Facebook, like the Incremental Development Alliance that has a wonderful Facebook page where people can post all the time about like, I'm thinking about starting out, what do I do? Or I have this piece of property that I've been eyeing that I love this house next door to me, but I'm scared to take that on. Like, what does that look like? How do I contribute to becoming a developer in my community? How do I contribute? I want to see better. It's just like we talk about politicians. Until you're willing to run, you can't expect to have better quality people until better quality people like yourself are willing to serve. And development and housing is exactly that. And in addition to, these networks of having these networks of people that I can reach out to when I have questions because I'm learning as I go, which we should all just remember John Anderson, he says, our goal is to do, I won't use the exact words, but incrementally less bad as it was done before, right? We think of developers as being like Darth Vader, and all we have to do is be better than Darth Vader. We just have to do better than what has been done. And if you have the heart in it, then, reach out to people that can help you build your resources and figure out how you can start putting names and faces to what affordable housing is. It's critical. When I get members of the community that are going to be living in housing, they won't move in for 2 years, but I let the members of the community know who it is that's going to be living there so that it's not some nameless, faceless, scary entity that, we don't want those people. We don't know who that's going to be. And it's like, you do. It is the school teacher. Like, it's your kid's teacher. Do you not want your kid's teacher living here? And they're like, oh, her I want living here. So, it's about doing it yourself, and through doing it and caring about your own neighborhood, building that community of who it is that lives in these areas together.
I like that inspiration about doing better than Darth Vader. I think I'm going to carry that into my weekend for sure. We have a couple of questions. Rick, I don't think I can hear you, but I see you talking, Rick.
We do have 2 questions in the chat. Yeah. Andrea, do you want to read those out to everybody, please?
Sure, absolutely. And the first question is, how do we change policy, especially federal, so that the rollout time post-disaster is drastically shortened? It seems like the rules are recreated with each disaster, so there's a big gap between the disaster and even beginning to apply.
You got to be prepared. Guess what? Disasters are happening. And I will push back on one thing that said Galveston, while Galveston is at the front door, the disasters are headed in the back door too. So it's your inland communities that are suffering from flood. Wharton is nowhere near the coast, but they have been hit by 3. Harvey was the 3rd flood in 18 months. And most of the rural communities that are stricken by these inland flood disasters, it's a rainy day. It doesn't get a name and it doesn't get any media attention. Yeah. And so the federal policy, it's less about policy and it's more about being ready. Because if you don't have a plan for how you're going to be moving, then when the resources become available, you're just starting to think about like, what do we want to do? So it's really about being prepared. Of course, there are some big federal policy changes that are going to be needed. That takes major reform at a level that most of us do not have access to. But at the local level, what we can do is be ready to move with every small event so that if we end up with a big event, we already have in our mind, a disaster is a terrible thing to have. The federal aid that you can receive, you have one bite at that apple. You better be prepared with knowing exactly how you don't want to put things back or what kind of housing. Who do you want? Which developers do you want designing your housing and building it? Otherwise, if you don't have the answer, someone will answer that question for you and it won't necessarily be who you think.
I just to carry on that, I mean, I think the impetus for our work, it wasn't explicitly stated always, but it was to serve as a quick roadmap when the disaster hits. How do we maximize and leverage the funding that we get? Because what happened after Ike is you had a huge committee that came together to try and figure out, okay, what do we do? But they didn't have their own homes. Nobody had anything. So you were trying to apply and create plans and strategy in the middle of a huge disaster, both personally and for the island. Which is why we are now 15 years later without having completed a lot of that work. And so what our framework outlined was when the disaster hits, here's what we're looking to build or rebuild. We already have the plan, we have the data, we have everything set to go. All we have to do is submit the application, right? And so I can't agree more that planning in a time when you are not keeping your head above water, but rather you have the strength and the sense to think about what do we want our community to look like in affordable housing in particular, it's a huge difference. The documents are ready to go. So I agree wholeheartedly with that statement.
Thank you both for that. And Andrea, last question.
Sure. And what are the best examples of places that are doing affordable housing right?
Libby, you want to take that one? Or Laura, it seems like you also unmuted real quick.
Well, I would just mention that Congress for New Urbanism is an organization that I'm actively involved in, and there are a lot of really brilliant architects and planners that are involved in Congress for New Urbanism that for decades have been working with not only HUD related, developments, affordable housing across the board at all levels of incremental infill, greenfield development. And so you can visit cnu.org, I think is their website, to find, and do some Googling of new urbanism and affordable housing. And there are, across the United States, there are spectacular examples. You wouldn't notice them when you walk by them because they're so beautifully done. It's not tagged as affordable. It's just really great housing. And so I think that the key is to do some Googling and get familiar with the architects and planners that are doing this on the regular.
Excellent. Thank you all. We really appreciate the time. A lot of what you all said kind of resonated with us at the Houston-Galveston Area Council. We've had our fair share of involvement in disaster recovery at the agency, and also what you talked about with regard to the smaller cities not having the resources to do this all on themselves. Please lean on your regional planning commission. For those of you cities that are on there, lean on your regional planning commission, your nonprofits. There is help out there, and that is what we are designed to do, in particular after disaster or planning for future disasters. And also with that question regarding what you can do at the federal level. We saw this post-Harvey. There was a bipartisan push to make sure that HUD issued rules within 90 days of the congressional appropriation. That was record time. And so we're hoping that that was included in the bill, but hopefully that's something that we see as a standard moving forward, making sure that those rules for how you spend those dollars come out quicker and quicker to make sure that the money gets to where it needs to go. Guys, I can't thank you enough. I wish we had all day to sit with you and learn about all the great work that you're doing. But a big thank you to Luis, Libby, Laura, and Keith for all of you joining us. It's really encouraging to hear about this. I do want to take a very quick moment and acknowledge some elected officials that we do have on the call. Our board chair, Councilwoman Nancy Arnold with the City of Waller, is joining us. Trustee Natasha Butler with A-Leaf ISD is also on the call. Councilwoman Sally Alcorn with the City of Houston. Councilwoman Teresa Vasquez Evans is with us. She's with the City of Kemah, but she does work with the City of LaPorte. I'm not sure which hat she's wearing today. And Brooke Bequatus with the General Land Office is always a strong partner. So our second panel today is going to focus on employment, what it means for a community undergoing revitalization, to support jobs and equity for the community. Our panel moderator, Ms. Claudia Aguirre, is President and CEO of Baker Ripley, an internationally renowned community development organization that has transformed neighborhoods across Houston for more than 113 years. They are partners with us in our workforce program. They have also just been charged with administering funds with the City of Houston in response to COVID-19. So I would like to welcome Ms. Claudia Aguirre to the line. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me good? Great. So good morning, everyone. What a great morning it's been. As mentioned, I'm Claudia Aguirre. I'm the president and CEO of Baker Ripley. And today's topic is really at the core of Baker Ripley's work. We are an organization that is rooted in making sure that this region prospers. Since our inception, we have been supporting our most vulnerable populations have an opportunity to be part of this region's economic engine. So it just gives me a lot of excitement to have a panel that is talking about equitable jobs. We will be talking about employment opportunities, how we address equity challenges in the region. And so the goal really is for you to walk away with maybe a new idea, a fresh perspective, perhaps some action steps that can be applied to our workplaces. So let's get started. Each panelist will briefly introduce themselves. I'll share a couple of questions with them and they can answer, and then we'll have a moment that you can ask your own questions for this panelist. We have two dynamic women with us, Dr. Melanie Price from Prairie View A&M University, and Sheena Salvino from the Pasadena Economic Development Corporation. Dr. Price, can you first introduce yourselves, maybe share an overview of your work as it relates to equitable jobs, and then Sheena, will you please follow Dr. Price?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. I am learning. I'm a Houston native, but I've been gone for 25 years and I've moved back, and I'm learning all kinds of organizations that I never knew existed. So this has all been very wonderful for me. I've been listening to the panelists today. Oh, let me just say this. I'm an endowed professor of political science at Prairie View A&M University. It's also my alma mater. I am also the director of the Ruth J. Simmons Center for Race and Justice. I also oversee their African American Studies Initiative. Here's the thing with going home, I keep telling people, if you go home to work in any community that you are a part of, you will go there to do one thing, and then you will find yourself with 37 other jobs that you had not planned to take on. And I'm sure lots of people, it seems, who are on this call can actually resonate with that, right? It's been interesting because today we've talked a lot about natural disasters and response to natural disasters. But one of the things that I would argue, or I was thinking as I was listening to you, is that racism and racial discrimination has really been a long cultural disaster in America, in the state of Texas, and in the Houston-Galveston area, right? It has meant the loss of untold human capacity and human capital, and it has contributed to the death of citizens through inequities and responses to all kinds of crises. Most recently, we see that in the response to COVID. You know, in schools like Prairie View, which is the second oldest land grant in the state, it is a historically Black college, is an institution that was created to respond to this disaster by filling the voids in education and training created by racism and racial discrimination. And, you know, we sit on the grounds of a former plantation. I don't know how many of you know this. And we take their great grandchildren and give them access to an education that those enslaved people saw as a key to their freedom. Like, we literally are creating our ancestors' wildest dreams, and we do a very good job at it. I'm gonna pat us on the back, right? We do a very good job. And so our students are majority Pell Grant recipients and majority first generation college students. And so these are the children that are restricted by, whose lives have been restricted by the redlining that we've talked about here today, and whose lives have been spent in public housing, moving from place to place, trying to understand what it means to be tethered to communities. And we use education to change the trajectory of their lives, but not just their lives, the lives of their families, their communities, and ultimately all of our lives are better for it. And so with the new Ruth J. Simmons Center for Race and Justice, we are taking a new approach. And that is, we are building capacity currently to do diversity teaching and training for organizations and corporations so that they have the ability to welcome these students into work environments. And that when they come there, that you don't undermine the work that we have done to train these students, to empower them, to make them ready. And so we are engaged in, we are getting projects off the ground, one that we should announce soon that looks at implicit bias training. We are developing capacity to do diversity coaching and to facilitate group workshops, so that our new thought process in the center is, you know, why go through the trouble of creating these dynamic and talented Black and Brown students to send them off into a hostile world? And so it is incumbent upon us to both tell them while they're with us, look, you have the capacity to do anything you want, and then work in the larger community, the larger environment, to create those spaces that we tell them they can go into.
Sheena.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Can you see me? I don't know if you can. Can you see or hear me?
We can.
Okay.
See and hear
Good.
you.
Go ahead, Sheena.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm really just psyched about all the panelists that I've been listening to, all the experiences, all the stuff that is being shared. So I want to keep the about me kind of brief, because if you really want to, you can give me a ring after this and learn all about Sheena Salvino. But as it stands, I am the redevelopment director in the city of Pasadena, and I work for the Economic Development Corporation. I am an army of one in redevelopment, and as we all know, redevelopment is a huge umbrella under which a lot of land falls, literally, figuratively. So I try to approach redevelopment in this very, sort of way that's being described and introduced at the beginning of this, and it sort of kind of evolved as I've been listening, as sort of this kind of corporeal approach to, revitalization in cities. And I even drew a little picture, which I won't share with you, but at its core, we're looking at, this sort of notion of home being where the heart is, and this notion of your hands being the work and your feet being the transportation and your mind being the place where you're holding that education and that power. So, it is really coming into this sort of notion of corporeality, and how that translates to community building. It starts, with your person, and, all of us as professionals, we start from a place, and we, kind of enjoy the company of like-minded folks, especially on these panels. So again, thank you to HGAC for putting this together to kind of help us all kind of work through these long challenges that we have, and the same things that we're facing, just in different scales. So I guess I can, again, go deeper and deeper into Sheena Salvino, but I'd rather just let's get going and talk about jobs and equity, and let's do it.
Well, great. Well, with that, let's get started. So I'd like to hear from both panelists on this question. So recent discussions, right, on the future of workplace have really highlighted this commitment to equity as a foundational principle and core value. But let's start with, what does it really mean to have equitable employment? And what are the advantages really of equity in our workplaces? So Sheena, if you'd like to start, and then I'd love to hear from Dr. Price too.
Sure. I think, we have to look at equity in a couple of different ways. There's, how the employer looks at equity and how the employee looks at equity. And I think from the employee view, from both views, you have to look at like the opportunity and risk associated with equity. And it's like each of us experiences opportunity at different levels, and each of us has risks at different levels. So, if I'm looking at an employee, they're likely not going to be, if they're of a lower advantage, they're not going to be likely to take many risks. And it's potential that they wouldn't be exposed to as many opportunities. So as us in the employment world, or us in the, public service in the public realm, we have to look at those, potential employment pool and say, okay, how can we, level the playing field in terms of, giving them the pipeline or plugging them into pipelines that allow them to be able to either increase their educational attainment or reduce the risk for them to enter into a new employment field. So I think, we have to look at all sides of those spectrums. So, and from the employer perspective, we have to ask as public officials and, people in our roles, we have to ask employers to, be responsible and, look for diversity and look for, building talent in their companies and starting with, including everyone in their companies. So I think, we do have to look at it on both sides of the spectrum.
Sure. I agree with all of that. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the thing that I have, we've been having lots of conversations over the last few months about these kinds of things. It's like we're kind of on an equity tour. I'm sure everybody on this panel can point to 5 other panels where they've had similar conversations. And so the thing that I have been saying to people is we have moved away from the word equality to equity, because there was this thing that happened when we were giving people equal opportunity. And that is, we still maintain the universality of a certain narrative or a certain story. And then we just gave people of color, women, people who are disabled, people who are a member of the LGBT community, like you can come in and adapt to what we are doing. That's what equal opportunity looked like. I had an accounting firm, and it was run by, the old white guys. The old white guys had set up that golf is the thing we must do. This is the way we must work. These are the foods we must eat. This is how we entertain clients. And if you were a person who was not of that characteristic, you showed up and you figured out how to become as much like them as you possibly could. That's how we did equal opportunity. Equity is more about including more stories, understanding differences in experience, about sort of meeting people at the places they are and building capacity for them to be successful at their job, and not assuming that everyone's route to success has to look the same. And all of that is about knowing the people you work with, understanding their cultures, not saying things that are problematic and be like, oh, I'm just old, I get to say these things. No, you don't. Like in equality of opportunity, I would be sitting there as a Black person and you turn to me and tell me some crazy story, and I would be too afraid to say anything to you because I don't want to rock the boat, because everybody here has agreed that this guy can be as racist as he likes. All of us have experienced jobs like this. In equity work, part of the job of the employer is to say, yeah, no, we don't do that anymore. No, you're not allowed to say those kinds of things. And not just because they're wrong, but also you're not allowed to make other people uncomfortable so that you remain comfortable in your privilege. It's those kinds of things, I think, that, we have to start looking at.
And I think that's an important point in this too for all of us, is that, cultivating leaders that are, really sincerely looking to create equitable environments for employees is mission critical for us, because the leadership, that run the cities, that run the organizations, that run the nonprofits, those are the examples. You got to set the example and, work with people to cultivate that. And, I think that's like one of our, more important missions for us as we create, equitable jobs and just creating in that environment in the city of Pasadena too. I mean, one of our local projects has been to create an impact program where it takes local business, young business leaders in the community, and maybe not leaders, but business people in the community, and tries to like bring them together and talk about what the challenges are in the community with and employing people and getting people upskilled to places where that they can be, contributing to different jobs. So it's I think for all of us, cultivating those leaders in our communities are important too.
And also, I think, if you invite any new group, any new person, any new key demographic into your organization and nothing changes, then you're not doing equity work. Mm-hmm. That's the measure, right? If you part of integrating new stories is to question the stories that exist, question the frames that exist, question the rules that exist. And if you have made no adjustments, then what you are essentially telling the new Latinx person you hired or the first Black person you hired in your job is that, look, we are done with our equity work by hiring you. Get in where you fit in. And that is not equity work. That is, we want to have a token demonstration. Beyond that, you have to do extra work. And that's the part of this, I think, that makes these conversations different than the conversations I was having 10 years ago, the conversations I was having 20 years ago. Doing your work is more than just saying we're hiring, more queer people to work here. It's actually listening to their stories, understanding, what their family dynamic is. It's like all of those kinds of things as well.
That's right, Dr. Price. So let's stay with, so the topic of race, justice, equity, as you've been discussing, is right in your wheelhouse, right? You've studied it, you've written it, you've taught it for so many years. So this next question, I just want to preface it with saying there is a lot to unpack when talking about equitable jobs and how we address the narratives that have been created duly maybe to targeted policies. So I would love to hear from you, why are communities of color having trouble finding work? And in your answer, can you please highlight how specific policies essentially have created some racial discrimination in the workplace, impacting the upward mobility of our communities of color?
Or, a lot of this for me is anecdotal. You have had so many people who seem like experts, but, I have been in academia my whole career. And so, I've worked at university, so I can tell you a lot about what students are thinking, and I'll try to explain sort of what I think about this too. And one of the things that I'll say is we rely a lot in hiring on things like networks, on things like comfortability or fit, as we like to call it. We rely on word of mouth from people we trust. And when those networks are narrow, when the understanding of fit is narrow, when the word of mouth of who you're getting these recommendations from is narrow, that's how you miss a lot of the people who would come into your equity work. So for instance, I study politics, and I'm not going to talk about current politics. I'm just going to use this one example as to, that's a minefield otherwise. But I will say this, we know that women are less likely to, like when you ask women who seem like they would make good politicians why they haven't run, a lot of them, many of them will say because nobody ever asked. And if you ask male politicians how they got into politics, they will say somebody asked them, oh, you're a lawyer, why don't you run for office? So that's part of it. Part of it is we have to do a better job of thinking about who we're asking. We have to expand our networks. So if you say, we just never seem to get any Black or Latinx people to apply to our accounting firm? Do you advertise your jobs with the Black Accountants Organization? Do you advertise your job with the Latinx Accounting Organization? Do you advertise your job in the Black newspaper? Do you advertise your job in Spanish language newspapers? Like, are you building wider network capacity? Are you building are you rearranging your notion of fit, right? And that is, fit often means, and I used to work in a small liberal arts in Connecticut, and they used to say it all the time, but fit, I came to understand, meant people they felt comfortable around. And the people they felt comfortable around were people who were raised like them, people who look like them, people who live like them, people who they could understand. And so those are the things that I think you have to really sort of question when it comes to jobs. And then there's easy stuff, like there's all kinds of bias against certain names. People are much more willing to hire a Heather than a Keisha, or an Adam than a Ahmad, right? Or a John versus a Jesus. And so those kinds of biases we also have to really think about when we're doing the work.
Interesting. Gina, how would you give us an example or something that on how we could develop an inclusive environment and have opportunities for the Jesuses and the Keishas and, you know?
Well, I guess I have, so I guess I should have said in my introduction, which here we are now, is that I'm an urban planner by education and background, and I'm an economic developer in profession. So I kind of spend a lot of and I'm out of the academic world. So I am more like, what can I do physically today at my desk? What kind of project can I work on that allows for a diversity of skill sets and, you know, creating places for people to get jobs, and how do I advertise it? And how do I make sure that people of color and women-owned businesses are getting opportunities to, you know, these large contracts and things like that. So for me, I come at this at such a different angle in terms of, you know, practice. So for all the planner, economic developer staff out there, you know, my job has been to create those opportunities. So what I do is try to create capacity and create opportunity for people to take advantage of. I can lead the horse, and, you know, we can all do some leadership, you know, be that leader and sort of say, hey, you know, these are things that we're putting together. These are the projects, these are the synergies, you know, here's how you can do it. And so things like, we can take from federal policy, for example, like Davis-Bacon wages. You know, we can ensure a certain wage minimum for our contracts we can ensure that, you know, there's a WMBE component to our contracts. Even if they're not state and federal government contracts, they're just your city contract, you can try to ensure that you build some of that equity into those contracts. Mm-hmm. So those are some policy type things. In terms of our developers and, you know, those who, and I have to say about Incremental Development Alliance, I'm working with, you know, and I'll plug that later. But incremental development is really important. And I think, you know, we'll get to that too in terms of equitable jobs, because it all fits together really nicely. But when you're talking to your developers, you know, they're getting these, you know, and oftentimes incentives from communities. And, you know, when you're putting those incentive packages together, you're going to say, okay, we're going to give you X dollar, but you got to give us Y, you know, community garden in place. You got to build us a park. You got to, if you're going to leave us in 10 years, you can't leave a gray field. You have to take down your building and return it to a green space. You know, these types of things. So we don't have these blighting influences left in our communities. And for people who are working in Houston, and for me in Pasadena, we don't have zoning. So you don't even have legal teeth to say, you can't do this here. So we have to really think about that too. And what's interesting on that component for Pasadena, and I'm not sure if our Houston folks have this, but my planning director referred to it as shade tree businesses, which essentially are small businesses that pop up in backyards that usually are working on cars and small mechanics for lawnmowers and those types of things for our communities, who are just under the shade tree and they're just in the backyard. Great, love the ingenuity, But what does that do to the environment around your house, that you're operating this business in? Does that, what is the externality associated with that? So that's some of the challenges that we're working on. You want to harness that entrepreneurialism and that small business development and kind of shape it in a way that builds up the community rather than, creates a degradation in some sorts. So, there's a lot of challenges in creating this, but, that's my thought on, creating an equitable environment is, allowing opportunity to, allowing this sort of spirit of entrepreneurialism to flourish, but keeping it in a shape that doesn't degrade its neighbors.
Yeah, thank you, Sheena. And so you mentioned
thoughts on all of that.
Yeah. So you mentioned Pasadena. So let's talk about that. Prior to your work in Pasadena, you spent a number of years in New York, strengthening Hudson's position as this emerging hub for creativity. You really prioritize projects providing quality jobs, training, employment opportunity for the residents there, which is really very purposeful if for all of us that have been in this type of work. What did Hudson do well that you want to establish in Pasadena, in this region? Any lessons you can share that you're working specifically in Pasadena from your best practice in New York?
What did Hudson do well? Hudson really cares. And that was one of the people in Hudson care about each other. They genuinely wanted that. It's a small city. It's like a dot it's not even a dot compared to Houston. It is a city block compared to Houston. So it's a small place. So it was like a petri dish. So I just want to, make sure that everyone's clear that Hudson is, teeny, teeny, weeny, tiny. So any activity I did, it was like you could test it and see if it worked and it would flourish or if it would blow up in your face. So, that was the positive of learning in that environment. So Hudson was, it has real connectivity. People really wanted to do well. And you could understand, who Hudson was. You knew it was, kind of a hip vibe. It had a metro. You could really, if Hudson were a person, you could know that person really easily. So I think, that was what was really what it was easy to work with because you knew who everyone, you knew who you were working with. I think that's been a challenge for me in Pasadena is identifying who Pasadena is because it seems to be in flux where there's like this challenge of, who the population is, which is almost 70% Latinx, and who the leadership has been for the last 40 years, which has been a middle-aged white male. And so I think the identities are conflicting with each other and whether or not one accepts or approves of the other is something that, has been a challenge. So, I can talk about how I'm trying to manage that, and I think the one thing that comes congruent between the two is the arts. So, Hudson was it had like an undercurrent of creativity and entrepreneurial spirit, and just people were there, like flocking to this, like very, the birthplace of art in America. It's at the Hudson River School of Painters. So you had this sort of like beautiful, nice kind of thing going on. And then, I'm in Pasadena now where it's extremely industrial and there's like this petrochemical blaze that, surrounds the city. So, and then you have a city that's like changed over the last 30 years completely from a primary Anglo to a now primary Latinx. And so I think identities are sort of shifting and the perception of the community is starting to change. So, ways I want it to come to its identity. I want it to, express itself, however it's going to be expressed. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of outlets for that. So I don't know if my connection is unstable or what, but, creating an atmosphere where people can come express that. And so I'm starting to do that here with Neural Arts Project and drawing in, sort of creative thinking and helping people see that there's, there are assets here in these. I'm probably getting away from answering your question, going off on a major tangent, but I think, us in practice, we try to think of creative ways to like, get one place to And, I'm fortunate enough that my board is very supportive of this idea and is allowing us to start a mural program. And its theme is revival. And we're, inviting Texas artists to come in and work with, building owners up in an area to talk about what that means. So we're trying to come up with, some identity and, to an earlier point, create some beauty in a city that is surrounded by heavy industry and bring some pride back to a community. So again, building that internal capacity, knowing who we are so we can stay where, we are someone and a place to be. Again, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Really...
No, that is very interesting. And as we think about the influx and the change in communities, I really think about our future and what that looks like and who that looks like, and thinking in terms of our students. Dr. Price, I'd love to talk a little bit about your work. I can imagine it rewarding to serve at your alma mater while enhancing
I love it.
The humanity, right, at Fairview. So as you prepare our future workforce to, in this work, in this equitable cutting edge research and creating the activists in the future workforce, talk to us a little bit about how you critically engage your students on diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? I mean, I think that the study and how we prepare our future is really how we teach our kids now, especially in universities such as Prairie View, that is at the core of this diversity, equity, and inclusion studies. And so how much emphasis, talk to us how you engage your students, and then what are some of the best approaches you're telling them on how to react and participate in this work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like I might be headed like Sheen along a tangent because you have packed so many good things in there. But I think, one of the things that I think is important to point out here is that even institutions like ours, whose only job has been to train Black students, since its inception, and we have a rapidly increasing Latinx population. And so, that's been our only job. And even we go through phases of how we understand what that is. And in this moment, right, where we have seen this summer of protests in reaction, we are the home of Sandra Bland, who was killed, as we know, who lost her life after a police traffic stop. We are the home of Robbie Tolan, who was shot, on his own driveway. We also are a place where since the 1970s, our local county has done lots of things that we view as unfair in terms of access to voting rights. And so, the lucky thing about us is that our kids they walk onto campus and the first thing we say is, you need to register to vote. You need to get this out. Like, we have a spirit of activism and organization that goes across generations. And a lot of that has been built by the external world, not just the county, but by things that happen, in the larger society regarding race. The thing that we're trying to do now is we're trying to have a much more directed impact. We used to be sort of an indirect, like, oh, well, indirectly, you'll learn all these things about organizing. You're here with all of these Black people and these Black professors, and you're going to learn all of these things. We're not making the assumption that that learning will happen. We are requiring, starting next year, that students will take a class called Race, Class, and Gender in America, where we talk about the development of racial ideas and racial thinking, talk about how gender and class also influences that, right? Because we don't just have students who are Black, we have working class students. And so there are ways in which all of those things are shaping their lives. But we really see ourselves as making critical consumers of the world. Like, no matter what your major is, when you come out of Prairie View, my goal is for you to be able to have critical conversations about the role of race, class, and gender in whatever you choose. So if you are an engineer, if you are a civil engineer, and it is your job to build freeways, I want you to understand the ways in which freeways have been used in Houston and all across the country to decimate communities of color. And so when you drive down 288, I want you to know that Black people used to live there, because I want you to do better when you are engaged in your profession. When you are an architect, I want you to understand gentrification. When you are a nurse, I want you to understand the history of racial discrimination in the medical profession. I want you to understand these things, not to put you on edge, but so that you are looking at your work in a way that doesn't reinforce the kinds of discrimination that already exist in those spaces, right? That's the way in which we, and by we, I mostly mean me, like Sheena. I am a
right.
one woman person.
So
And now,
sitting here, Dr. Price, I'm sitting here thinking, what do I do that is like racially unequal, in my building? I'm like, I do complete streets, and I'm like, what kind of education? I'm sitting here like, what can I do better? And I hope we're all sitting here like, what can we do better?
Also thinking about this as a person who has moved home, I've moved to the 3rd Ward area. I want to live near my family. And one of the things that I discovered, I came in January 2019, and I moved in with my mom. I'm like, I'm just gonna take some time. I'm gonna look around, see what happens. And within 6 months, I was like, you need to figure out something. Otherwise, you're not gonna be able to afford to live near your mom, right?
That's right.
You will not be able to afford it. You will be priced out. And so I'm thinking about this as I'm actually living neighborhood transition, as I'm actually living through this summer of protest and political unrest, like all of these things. And I share with my students those vulnerabilities as well. I mean, I think part of the fear in American life is the fear of being wrong about race. And in that fear and silence, you often, I think, make more mistakes than you would if you just sometimes ask the question. And you ask it in a way that implied that you are serious about knowing, not in a judgmental way, not in a, like part of it is that kind of thing, because we don't have a lot of human trust, and we don't have, like Sheena was talking about, sort of building community capacity. Because in a lot of places, I would guess Hudson, I don't know very much about it, it's often easier to build that in places that are predominantly one race.
Hudson's got this perfect tale of two cities in the same way that lots of cities have. Like I said, it is a petri dish, exact replica of many, many, many cities.
Right.
You have the on the north side and the haves on the south side, and like there's a very clear line physically and financially. Right. And kind of creating that place where they came together was, I mean, a huge part of the community development work. Sure. And creating housing policy and planning around some of that. And it's hard work. I mean, no one on this call is going to say this is just, we can do this with one panel and we all know what's going to happen next.
If only.
But it's good to like hear.
Yeah. So for us, part of the thing is, rather than training our students in the same way we would, what every other university would train them to be architects or nurses or teachers, and then have them have to get out in the world and figure out how to manage in these spaces, we want to do a little bit more work on the front end of sort of helping them understand the landscape of sort of what the profession that they're going into will look like, right? That is, so when you, I don't even know if we train urban planners. That's out of my wheelhouse. But anyway, when we're in the School of Architecture and they're training people to do whatever they do over there besides, I don't know, build buildings. But when they're over there, the question is, are we also making them thoughtful about the world that they actually want to live in? Are we making them thoughtful about the kinds of spaces that they occupy? Are we making them thoughtful people? That's my job, is to make them thoughtful. And then when you hire them, then hopefully when you're together working on projects, when you're trying to figure out what comes next, they're not just offering up the same thing. Hiring them means you don't just get the same thing you got if you hired somebody from Texas A&M. You actually get somebody who is both, who embodies diversity, but also thinks about things from a diverse perspective. I want you to have both of those things together.
Thank you, Dr.
Dr. Price. We could hear, we could continue to hear both from you and Sheena all day. I do want to leave some time for a question or two. I don't know if there was some questions that we can ask now to the panelists. Rick?
Yes, please. Folks, if you can, please in the chat box at the bottom, or as the instructions tell you on the screen, type in your question to any of these fine panelists and make them good. So this is your one shot to hear from some of these experts.
Nah, you can call me afterwards. I did want to comment while we're waiting for.
Just email me. Don't call because I'm not in my office anyway. I'm working from home, and so anyway.
I did want to comment on incremental development as part of capacity building. I mean, I can't stress that enough. I, come from a place in New York where you didn't have big developers developing huge numbers of housing because they're old communities and people love historic preservation in New York, and it's not the same here. It's like you build a house for 30 years, knock it down, and a new neighborhood pops up. It's nuts. So it's just a different, so, it's been a learning curve for me, but, getting people to understand, like you can preserve a building and you can do an adaptive reuse project that's going to, enhance the neighborhood. Like buy that warehouse next door for, pennies, turn it into a coffee shop, turn it into, a workforce center, turn it into. So it's like, and that's, part of our capacity building is we're going to work with Monty and John. Monty Anderson is the guy over at Incremental Development that I work with, and Kevin Shepard at Verdunity, to kind of host a workshop for our small developers. And how we're finding them, we're going into our permits applications and looking at who's permitting for housing. And we're going to say, okay, let's call this person and say, do you want to come to a workshop and learn about how you can do more with what you're, doing already? And, these people are homeowners who are doing their own work, or people who are doing small 1 and 2 family apartment buildings. So calling them directly and making those connections, building those relationships for incremental development is super duper important. Even if your city is 150,000 people like it is in Pasadena, small pockets, just create bigger ripples. So that's what we're hoping.
And that's what I mean about being creative about your networks and being creative about how you recruit and solicit people. It's those kinds of things, right? That's more work than just, sending out a mass email to builders. That's more work, but it actually is more beneficial for the community in the long run.
And we did have a question from Jeff Table for Sheena. How can cities use economic development incentives to get employers to hire local and become partners with the community?
I guess it depends on how your incentives are set up, if you're a type A and type B. So in economics, we hold all things equal. So let's assume all things are equal and you can, provide incentives and you have a structure to do that. I'm doing it in the form of grants, in the form of matching grants. So I'm incentivizing, a small business, to improve their the envelope of their building, that stabilizes the community, increases the aesthetic, and improves their potential return on that building. I have to do it for business related commercial enterprise. I can't do it for households because my organization isn't set up that way. So for economic development, we're focusing on small business retention expansion programs. We do grants, and because the other funding has to be tied to a number of jobs, that incentive is for much larger employers. I'm focused on creating communities and developing. So I don't know if that helps you. And I'm in the middle of creating a demolition grant for those things that are just blights on the community and you just can't do anything with. You just can't do anything with it. And we know what those look like and are just longstanding eyesores and zombies in our communities. So a demolition program, a business enhancement program that improves the envelope of a building. And that could be the facade, but also the foundation and the roofing, because those two things are very expensive. And oftentimes small businesses just don't have the resources to do those kind of things. So those are the ways that we're trying to support it through incentives. And we're just developing grants to that extent. I hope that helps, Jeff. And then for Wendy, for the workshop, it's in January. So it's been COVID, spiking. We don't want to do anything. So what we want to do is have an online workshop. And then I have 2 big projects. They're not big. they're about a mile in length in terms of corridor redevelopment. So I'm taking all the business owners and creating, little, I don't know, what do you want to call them? They're my little crews that, are my business owners and my building owners that I go to and say, hey, like, what's your challenge? Parking. Okay, then I can go back to city and say, okay, my businesses can't park anywhere. How can I get them the things they need? So that's how I'm kind of operating right now. Very small, very neighborhood, very non-giant developer. So the workshop is scheduled, we're hoping to schedule in January, and I don't know how I would let it all but if you want my email, I can give it to you here. And if you want to join the virtual version of it, I can totally put you in there.
If
So,
you could put it in the chat, that would be great. I think we do have an additional question for you. If you could respond to it in the chat, we do need to move on, ladies. I hate to break it now, but we do, in the essence of time, we need to move forward. I want to thank all three of you for your broad perspective. Claudia, from your perspective, Sheena and Dr. Price, it's been a really enlightening presentation. So I want to thank all of you for being with us. So it's, before I go on to our mini break, I did also want to acknowledge Mayor Robert Nelson with the City of Bay City is also joining us virtually. Thank you for being here, sir. Thank you. It's time for our second mini break of the day. For this mini break, we're going to hear from HGAC's Dr. Pramod Sambidi, who is in our Community Environmental Department. He's going to talk about how some of the tools his group have been developing can help you better understand the equity needs in your individual communities. Much of the data that we put out in HGAC is free of charge, and you can find it on our website. I'm not sure if some of the tools that Pramod Sambidi is going to be showing you is behind a paywall, but I really doubt it. So always look to our website for a resource on any of your data needs. He does fantastic work, and it's a real pleasure to have him here. So without further ado, Pramod, take it away.
Right. Thank you, Rick. Good morning, everyone. We had a lot of good discussion on equity in terms of housing and jobs. And later we'll be listening in terms of transportation. But this mini break session is more focused on data and tools and how they can be utilized in incorporating equity in your planning and work. So before I jump into let me share my screen. Okay, can you all see my screen?
It's showing up right now, Pramod.
Okay, so before I jump into the demonstrating the tool, I'd like to recap what we heard in the mini break session 1 on the polling in terms of how often do we incorporate. There is a 50-50 on incorporating equity into the work. And in terms of looking at the biggest barriers, we heard that it's around 56% need to learn more, and there is also information on we don't have much data. We need to incorporate equity into planning. So this tool will kind of help you in identifying the data and crossing that barrier. And in terms of question 3, what is the biggest short-term opportunity? I think around 75% has said we would like to expand our public meeting or engagement, and also incorporating equity into the upcoming planning. So this tool, again, I will show you how can be utilized in identifying areas for your public meeting as well. So let me get into the tool. So here is the tool, and it kind of shows you the regions of vulnerable population where they are located. And it will also show you the low moderate income population, as well as historic settlements. And in addition to the demographic data, the tool also provides current and future community and transportation plans. So that it includes 2045 regional transportation plan with projects funded for the future in the future, as well as livable center studies and metro moving forward projects, as well as data related to crash and accessibility and sidewalks and public transit. So there are 4 tabs, and the first one is the regional equity profile. So here, this is a dashboard which provides a lot of demographic information for our 13 county region. And here you can see the HGAC's 13 county map. And here you look at the population. So we are around, there are around 7 million people living in our region. And we have population in terms of household and as well as housing units. And if you look at our historic growth, our region has grown from 3.2 million in 1980 to around 7 million in 2018. So as you can see, our region is adding around 1 million people every decade. And let me enlarge this. And we also have data on vulnerable population, which includes population in poverty, minorities, as well as limited English proficiency, disabled, elderly, carless, as well as single female householder with children. And as you can see, around 1 million people in our region are in poverty, and around 0.5 million in our region are with a disability. So that's there's a lot of vulnerable population in our region. And if you look at the hard low moderate income, which is housing and urban development data, around 2.5 million people in our region are low to moderate income. And in terms of here, we can see the distribution in terms of race. As you know, our region is racially diversified with 37% Hispanic, 37% white, 17% Black, and around 8% Asian. And we also have breakdown by age, education, income, and home ownership, language, as well as vehicle ownership and the mode choice to work. And the data is also available for cities. So if you click on cities, you'll see the data for cities in our region. And if you're interested in a particular city, you can click on this arrow and select whatever city you're interested in. Like, for example, I'm selecting Alvin. And as you can see, we have Alvin on the map. And the data here reflects information or demographic characteristics of people living in Alvin. And if you're interested in looking at a neighborhood level data, or if you're interested in the demographic characteristics of your project area, you can use this block level data, block group level data, and you can click on this arrow and you can make a selection using a rectangle or a lasso or a circle. And I'm here using a lasso. And once you make a selection, the data will be updated on the dashboard. So the data that is that you're looking at here is reflected to the area you selected. So it's a very easy to use tool where you can find a lot of information. And let me go back to the tool. So that's the equity profile. And now we also have instant maps. So if you're looking at some maps for your presentation or for your study, you can utilize this tool. So this has data on demographic data from US Census American Community Survey, as well as vulnerable population and hard low moderate income. So I selected vulnerable population and I selected owns no vehicle. So as you can see, this tool instantly provides you an interactive map, and you can use this print button at the bottom to kind of print the map. So there's a lot of variables that you can look at and get maps readily available for you. And finally, we get to the advanced tool, and this is mainly focused for planners who want to use this tool in their planning activities. And here, what you see is the vulnerable population in our region. So the dark areas are the ones where we have a lot of vulnerable population. And we have several other layers in addition to the vulnerable population. So if you're interested in like historical data, preservation data, we have the data available here. We have historical landmarks from the city of Houston, as well as we also have data on Texas freedom colonies. So these are settlement areas, African American settlement areas. So we have information on that as well. And we have data on metro moving forward projects, HGAC's livable centers, as well as a regional transportation plan. These are the projects that are funded for the future. And let me unselect it, the vulnerable population, and let me focus on how you can utilize this tool in your project and planning. So for example, if you're interested in identifying vulnerable population for a selected transportation project, you can click on that project and you can click on these dots here and set location. And as you can see, it summarizes the data for you, and you can add a buffer. So I'm adding a 1/4 mile buffer here. And once you add the buffer, you can click on the demographics. It provides you demographic information around that corridor, as well as data on vulnerable population. And if you're interested in downloading the data, you can simply click on this here, and it will generate a spreadsheet for you where you can see all different demographic data for that particular corridor. So, and there are some other tools. Because of the time, I'm not able to show them, but you can go to more info, and we have a user guide here, as well as a video tutorial and other definitions for the variables utilized in the application. So Rick, that's all I have, and it's open for questions.
And part of many of these tools also have these little pop-ups. If it's the first time that you've used the tool, they have little pop-ups that help guide you on how to use them. Sometimes I can get lost in all of this, but they do a fantastic job, and you can always call Dr. Pramod Sambidi or his team, and they're happy to help you through how to navigate these. I access them more and more often. Before, I used to email Pramod and ask him for data, and realized all this information is readily available on our website and available for your use. So please use it. I'm still trying to get Pramod to add a list of best restaurants in a particular area. We'll see how far we can get with that. So we have one final panel discussion, and our last panel today is going to focus on transportation equity and what that means for our region. So our panel moderator is Miss Monique Johnson with the City of Sugar Land. She's been with the City of Sugar Land for 6 years, currently serves as the city's Transportation and Mobility Innovation Manager. She oversees the Transportation and Mobility Innovation Program within the Engineering Department at the City of Sugar Land, a great partner of HGAC's. During her time at the city, she's been involved in the implementation of the city's comprehensive mobility plan and pedestrian and bicycle master plan. So please welcome Monique Johnson to the workshop as she leads the next panel discussion, our final panel discussion. Monique?
Thank you, Rick, and good morning, everyone. Well, I think it's still morning. Yes, it's 11. So good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here. It's been a very informative and very interesting discussion. So I look forward to continuing that with our panel. We have a good group. We have Mr. Brian Smith and Mr. Richard Petty that will be a part of our panel discussion. So what we'll do is go ahead and start off with introductions. Brian, would you like to start off?
Brian, I think we may be having some audio issues. We can see you, but we can't hear you. No, we cannot.
Okay, let's start with Richard Petty, so that way Brian can get his audio fixed. Richard?
Brian, you can always join us via phone as worst case scenario if you need to, okay? The information's in the chat, and we'll go on to the next panelist. Go ahead, Mike.
All right. Well, good morning, Monique, and good morning, Brian, and look forward to hearing you shortly. And it's a great pleasure to be part of this responsible redevelopment workshop this morning, and I've certainly appreciated working with Kathy and the planning team, and all of Chuck's team has done really excellent work, and that's something that we've all seen already this morning from the other presentations. And I've enjoyed meeting Monique and Brian, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today. And I believe that you have some slides, and we'll, if they're there, then that's good. I'll just highlight with you that I'm the important affiliations that I have to highlight this morning for this discussion are that I am chair of the Houston Commission on Disabilities, and I'm also board chair of Link Houston. And those organizations have been heavily involved around transit equity. Link Houston is an organization. It is a nonprofit organization that has an excellent team of leaders, and they have worked with many communities to help those communities address their concerns and their needs for access that will support people's access to opportunity. And there I'll just mention, I'm the outgoing chair of both of these organizations, and I'm excited to tell you that those who are going to be following me, although I'm not making an announcement of the next incoming chairs, but those who are going to be following me are excellent leaders and look for great things from both organizations. And let's please move on to another slide if there is one here for me. And I'm a person with a disability, and by the way, I have no vision, and that's why I'm not entirely sure that my slides are present, and so appreciate your forbearance with that in case they're not, but I trust that they are. And I'll hope today to talk a little bit more about some of the things that will help us have greater equity in transit. One is better access to areas of equity. And we've made improvements, in fact, to acknowledge Metro and the work that the High Capacity Transit Task Force that was part of the transit efforts of the Houston-Galveston Area Council. And it is encouraging that in all the areas that I will speak about, we have made some progress and we have much more to make. Making sure that neighborhoods that have poor service now or improving service now, that need better service, that there is good frequency of bus service and rail service, if that's the case. And that's recently occurred in Northeast Houston. They've added Metro has added a late night connector, which is very, very important and useful to people who are using this service to get to employment. And Metro's added also some bus stop improvements in the Gulfston area, which is one of the highest density working communities in Houston and in this region. There's a need for people with disabilities that there is good access through safe sidewalks and intersections to get to transit stops. The transit stops are accessible to people who use wheelchairs, that they're safe and convenient. Also, that there's good first mile and last mile connection. That means that we can get people into high capacity transit, but we need to get people off those transit systems and to their doors or to their workplace. And or wherever else they're going. Connector systems are important, and really a robust paratransit system is important. Of course, the more that the main service of the systems is accessible, the less demand there will be on the paratransit systems, and that's an important factor. Also, to acknowledge that Metro has made improvements of over 300, accessibility improvements of over 300 bus stops to make them more accessible. They've done some physical built environment changes to make those stops accessible to wheelchair users. They've included better real-time information on tablets in those stops so that people can make better decisions about the service that they'll be receiving. And I hope we will also be able to talk today about what we can do to make transit more accessible and more available, and letting our colleagues at Metro know that we support improvements through Metro Next for equity in transit for all people. That's people with disabilities, people from the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, people of color, all people. And that we have better neighborhood access in neighborhoods that have not been as well served in the past, again, while acknowledging the work that's been done. And in addition, more engagement and better engagement for all of us, getting to understand what the real issues for people are, knowing that and supporting after we know that, and helping all people to have a voice in this process. They don't always have to be the tried and true conventional approaches of public meetings. There are much better ways of doing that. We've certainly learned a lot about new ways of access during this COVID-19 emergency, and we have much more to learn and apply there. So I hope that Brian has audio ready, and again, it's a great pleasure to be with you today, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Richard. Brian, were you able to join us?
Yes, can everybody hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you again for inviting me. Good morning, everyone. And I'm very excited to be here. So when I first got the invitation to be a part of the panel, a quote came to mind from Monica Lewis Patrick, who's a water justice warrior from Detroit, where I'm originally from. She once said at a meeting, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And my journey has taken me from grassroots organizing 6-7 years ago to working in research and engaging environmental justice communities around data, and now transitioning into planning, and being a planner here with the city. I'm taking full responsibility and understanding that it is a part of my job and a part of the work to uplift the voices that normally aren't heard when we're having these conversations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're trying to do that and achieve equity through our Vision Zero Houston plan. If you are not aware, on an annual basis, about 220 people are killed and 1,000 are seriously injured in Houston in traffic crashes, and these are all preventable deaths. And what we're trying to do is get to zero in the next 10 years. And our approach is really looking at combining both community-driven outreach and data-driven interventions in order to create equitable action. For our outreach, we've been just consistently trying to figure out who's not at the table, who haven't we talked to yet. And even, we're not letting COVID stop us, so we've been able to be more dynamic with our online presence, from hosting virtual open houses, having multiple interactive websites through Let's Talk Houston and our social media presence, but then even still looking for opportunities to do our traditional engagement by putting information in the hands of super neighborhoods, and even having some in-person, safely social distance outreach events at transit centers to talk to people who are riding transit, who are walking, who are biking through Houston and the city on a regular basis, to make sure we've got their feedback. And I'm thankful to Dr. Sambidi for talking about data, because we've really been looking at data in our approach. So this map on the right is our high injury network, where we found that only 6% of our street grid outlined in red are responsible for almost 60% of our fatal and serious injury crashes. So we know where we need to start our interventions, but we're also adding another level to it. You see a lot of areas on the map shaded in gray. These are census tracts that are high on the CDC's social vulnerability index. And that index uses 15 socioeconomic factors to talk about which communities are most at risk. And we're adding this layer to say, okay, well, we know where the crashes are happening, but where can we also refine this to make sure we're starting off with the hardest hit communities? And with this approach, we've been able to kind of refine our 50 actions in our action plan that is about to come out to 13 priorities, with this also geographic targeting of where we're going to put things. And a good example is what's going on right now in Galveston. Next slide. And so the Galveston community is already a part of Mayor Turner's Complete Communities program. And it's an ideal place for us to start, because, we're talking about an area that is multi-diverse with racial, ethnic, and immigrant minorities, tracks high on the social vulnerability index, and Hillcroft Avenue, which goes through Galveston, is a part of our high injury network, where it has a 2 times the crash rate as similar streets in Texas. So this is a perfect place to start making it and changing it to where we're prioritizing safety for all users. So we've been working with the community, working with the mayor's office, and we've created a list of interventions and recommendations, from reducing Hillcroft from 8 to 6 lanes, incorporating protected bike lanes, widening sidewalks, improving bus stops, crosswalks, and just increasing lighting and signaling to make it safer for everybody. This is a place where more people than average are walking and cycling, and we want to make sure we're planning for them and not just cars. And I'm excited to be on the panel, and yeah, let's get into the questions and the discussion.
Thank you, Brian and Richard. Those are great introductions. One of the things that I wanted to touch on before we get into the questions, we've had some really interesting conversations preparing for this, just talking about equity in transportation, what that means. And one of the questions that we would like to start off with is, what is equitable transportation? How does your community define that? One of the things that we're working on in Sugar Land is our mobility master plan. And so through this process, we are learning what that is. We don't really know what that means yet. We have a group of 23 citizens on our mobility task force, and we've been working with them for pretty much the past year. And we are really starting to learn what that means for Sugar Land, for the residents of Sugar Land, and the people who use the mobility system. And so I guess, Richard, we'll start with you. What is equitable transportation, and how is it defined in the community?
Well, thank you. Well, equitable transportation, in my view, and that is that where people do have equal access to the transit systems in the community, that they have equal access, not only that the buses themselves or trains or other vehicles are wheelchair accessible, that the sidewalks are safe to those bus stops, that the intersections nearby are safe, that people can move safely from their homes and their businesses and other places to which they will travel, that there's reasonable frequency of service in all areas, and especially areas where there sometimes are areas of economic disadvantage, and there are good, and I did touch on some of this earlier, but when the mainline system is not fully capable, that there is a good paratransit system taking people from curb to curb for the places that they need to be. So it is for me, it is certainly impacts people with disabilities. That's a personal interest of mine, and many of folks that I know in the disability community are deeply interested in that, and we did in the past couple of years, the Houston Commission on Disabilities appointed a high capacity transit, not a high capacity, but a transit task force, a safety for intersections and sidewalks. And that was specifically about getting to the transit system. And that access is just paramount for people with disabilities. I'm also interested in access for everyone. I believe it's morally and ethically the thing that we should be doing, and it's also economically beneficial for our entire community.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going, oh, Brian, would you like to add to that question?
Yeah, first off, well said, Richard. I mean, when I think about equity, the first thing I started writing down is like, whoever wants to can. So if you want to go somewhere, you should be able to get there in a safe, timely, and not burdensome manner. And thinking about equity in transportation, I'm gonna, acknowledge my own privilege as a 6'2", able-bodied guy with a reasonable, reliable vehicle. If I am only planning for people like me, I'm missing out on a whole lot of people who don't have, that same access that I have. So, being mindful of everybody not having the same experience and accounting for that is really important for me.
Yes, those are both great points. And that's also something that has come up during our conversations with our planning process, is really getting, the group and just people in general to think beyond just their own needs and desires for transportation, kind of thinking beyond that and trying to understand the needs of others and making sure that their needs are met as well. And so it's something that, typically we probably don't think about, but through different planning processes, that's probably a way for us to start broadening that perspective on equitable transportation and start actually taking action to to implement some of those things. A follow-up question to that, we talk about access. That's usually the topic when we talk about equity and people being able to get to where they want to go, however they want to get to, whatever mode they choose. But what are some other hidden issues that are embedded in equitable transportation? Brian, would you like to start?
Yeah. So thinking about, well, one, kind of going to the earlier conversation about humanizing the people who are living in affordable housing and humanizing the people who have the housing need. I think we need to do the same with the writer. I think we need to make sure that we're considering that there are people there and not just numbers. And when we start adding human elements to the data, I think is very important too. So one thing that we've been doing with the high injury network is also looking for additional context, such as there are going to be some streets and intersections that aren't going to show up because crashes aren't happening, because people stop going there because they don't feel safe. So if we rely solely on those numbers, as far as where the crashes are, then we're omitting an entire area where, there's a problem that exists, but the public has just written off as something that's never going to get fixed. And I think with a lot of the systemic issues that have been talked about this morning, we have to do a better job as government to identify those areas where people just have lost faith that we're going to do anything, and start figuring out how can we add interventions there too.
And if it's okay, I would love to add to that. And that's Brian, you've made perfect points there. And, practical access to areas. It may be, for example, if you live in Galveston, you may need to go to a grocery store, or you may need to go to some place that's not terribly far from your home, but you may have to ride multiple buses. You may have to go far out of your way to get to some place that for all reasons should be accessible to you from your community. If it's a drugstore or a grocery store or whatever it might be, instead of taking many hours, and that's not an exaggeration. It could take far longer for you to make a simple trip that so many will take for granted, being able to hop in a personal vehicle and go there. And that's important, and that's probably hidden to many people.
Yes, both great responses. And, just thinking some more about this, people, like we said, we talked about access and thinking beyond that. There are some instances where there is access to, let's say, a bus stop or a transit stop, but maybe it's not well lit or people don't feel safe. And so, it's some of those issues also that, like you said, that human perspective where, yes, they have access, but is it safe? Do they feel safe? And do they want to use what they have? Does it run on time? Some of the things we talked about were shift workers and people who work, don't work the normal 9 to 5 hours. And they, do they have access to transit at that time, and how often does it come? And so those are some of the things that, tie into those barriers that go beyond access as well. All right. So another question, what do you consider the greatest barriers to achieving equitable transportation? And what are some opportunities to address those barriers? Brian, would you like to start?
Yeah. So I think one of the largest barriers is trying to move past this car-centric culture. And I think the other one is single medium methods of engagement. So when we're thinking about transportation, going straight to vehicles first and then everybody else. And we need to start thinking about all users, because cyclists, people who are walking, people in wheelchairs, people who are just utilizing public transit, they should not be afterthoughts. They should be incorporated into the right-of-way and the streetscape as much as possible. And then when I say single medium methods, I think what we've been able to do with COVID is, try to figure out what are some other ways that we can engage the public outside of a planning commission meeting or a public hearing, because we can't have everybody in City Hall, at that time. And we've really had to step out of the box. And I think that we should not lose these opportunities, because one, these are things that we could have been doing all along. We've had the technology for a while now. And then two, these are also opportunities that we should not forget. And instead of going back to the way of doing things when we reach a normal, how do we incorporate these procedures into our current process to make engagement more robust?
And, in terms of safety, I think safety, and this is from a highly personal perspective, safety is paramount. And it's important. Although it is easy for many to want to address safety as a matter of driver education, when in fact safety may be affected far more by unsafe design of intersections. One of the members of the Houston Commission on Disabilities was hit in a crosswalk near Rice University last year. And I would dare say that looking at the speed at which traffic can move through that particular intersection, because of the way the intersection is designed, it's designed for speed. There are intersections on my personal path of travel to the bus route that I would use, where I've experienced near misses in year past. Thank goodness for that. And even in the Texas Medical Center Transit Center, I've had some pretty near misses too, and I am pleased that Metro has made some improvements and done better signage, that their drivers will be expected to stop for pedestrians. Those centers are busy, noisy, difficult places, and I hope now safer. And Houston's sidewalks can often be not well maintained, and we have much more to do there. And all those things, I believe, are incredibly important.
Great, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Brian. For the sake of time, what we're going to do is open it up to questions from the audience. So did we receive any?
Yes, we do have one question. It is, how should we be thinking about equity in terms of the way we manage curb space in the region?
All right, Brian, would you like to start with answering that question?
Sure. So I think we need to think about kind of going back to who's using the curb and who's utilizing the curb. And also, what have we been doing with our curbs this year, now that a lot of people aren't going out and about and parking? And we've been able to utilize curb space and these old parking spaces for seating or, for pop-ups. Cyclists have felt a lot safer even in roads that don't have protected bike lanes, because there isn't a lot of traffic and things like that. So how do we, just kind of going back to the conversation about getting away from car-centric planning, The same thing it needs to be done for curbs, because we continuously just think that curbs are for parking, and they are way more dynamic, and we need to foster an environment where we can utilize those spaces better. We're excited about launching our More Space program, where we're kind of doing that on Main Street.
And Brian's headed to that. You know, if more of us lived in accessible, walkable communities, and if more of us use transit, those parking spaces might not be needed nearly as much as they seem to be now. Before we go on, let me acknowledge also that Brian and the city planning team is making headway with the Vision Zero group about some of the issues that I pointed up earlier about intersection safety, and that's encouraging, but we have a long way to go.
Agreed, Richard. I appreciate you for saying that. I know you've been involved in our process, and thanks for helping us make sure we're doing right by everybody.
We do not have any additional questions in the chat. If anybody wanted to type one in real quick, you could.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you both, Brian and Richard. That was a great discussion. I wish we had more time to discuss. We can go on and on about this, but I really appreciate it. And I appreciate HGAC for inviting all of us to be a part of this, planning workshop this year. And so we look forward to more discussions.
Thank you, Monique, Richard, and Brian. I really appreciate all of you ending our workshop today on a fantastic note on responsible revitalization and equity in Houston-Galveston region. So that concludes our program today, but this isn't the end of our conversation. As you all know, HGAC is going to continue to explore this topic for future workshops and events. If you have specific topic recommendations or any feedback for our amazing staff on the quality of this workshop, please email us using the contact info that is on the screen. Before I leave today, I did want to acknowledge the work once more of our very talented team of professionals that put this event on today. Andrea Tantalo, Cheryl Murgo, Jeff Table, the Director of Community and Environmental Planning, Kathy Jansen, who made everything run very, very smoothly today and was fantastic behind the scenes, Dr. Pramod Sambidi, who you heard from, and Sarah Torreson. So thank you again. We really appreciate it. Thank you for being a fantastic audience. And with that, we'll end the workshop. And thanks again. Have a wonderful day.